On the morning of August 18, 1590, a small boat pushed off from the deck of an English ship anchored in the shallow waters off the Carolina coast. The men at the oars pulled hard against the Atlantic swell, their eyes fixed on a strip of sand and forest rising from the gray-green sea. In the stern sat a man of perhaps 50 years, his face weathered by 3 crossings of the Atlantic and 3 years of waiting. His name was John White. He was the governor of a colony that might no longer exist. The sky that morning was the color of old pewter. A storm had passed through the night before, drowning one of his search boats and 7 of his men in the treacherous waters between the barrier islands. The wind still carried the smell of rain and salt and something else. Smoke, perhaps, or the memory of smoke. White had seen it the evening before as they approached the island, a column of pale smoke rising from the northern end of Roanoke, curling into the darkening sky. He had ordered his men to sound their trumpets and fire their guns to let the colonists know that rescue had finally come. The sounds had rolled across the water and vanished into the pines. No one had answered. Now, in the gray light of morning, he could see the shore clearly. The beach was empty. The trees beyond stood silent and indifferent, the same trees he remembered from 3 years before, though they seemed taller now, closer, as if the forest had crept toward the water in his absence. His daughter was somewhere in those trees. His granddaughter, Virginia, who had been 9 days old when he last held her, would be 3 years old now, walking, talking, a person with memories and fears and a favorite song. If she was alive. If any of them were alive. The boat ground against the sand. White stepped into the shallows, the cold water soaking through his boots, and walked up the beach toward the palisade he had helped build 3 summers before. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. What he found there would haunt history for the next 4 centuries. The houses were gone, not burned, not destroyed, dismantled, taken apart piece by piece, the timbers carried away to some purpose he could not imagine. The chests containing the colonists' possessions, his own possessions, books and maps and armor, had been dug up and broken open, their contents scattered and rotting in the sand. And carved into a post at the entrance to the empty settlement, cut deep into the wood with a knife or chisel, was a single word. Croatoan. No cross above it, no mark of distress, just the name of an island 50 miles to the south and the name of a people who lived there, and the silence of the Carolina pines. John White stood in the ruins of England's first American colony and understood that he would never know what had happened to his family. He would never know where his daughter had gone or whether his granddaughter had lived to see her first birthday. He would sail away from this shore and spend the remaining years of his life in a country that had forgotten about Roanoke almost before he returned, and he would die without answers, and the questions he carried would outlive him by centuries. This is the story of those questions. This is the story of 117 English men, women, and children who sailed across 3,000 miles of open ocean to build a new life in a land they did not understand, among peoples they had already wronged, in a place so remote that when they vanished, no one came looking for them for 3 years. It is the story of the first English child born in the Americas, whose name we know and whose fate we do not. It is the story of what happens when empires reach too far, too fast, with too little understanding of what they are reaching for. And it is, perhaps most of all, the story of a silence that has lasted more than 400 years, broken only by fragments and theories, and the quiet persistence of a word carved into wood. Croatoan. The sources that survive for the Roanoke colony are sparse, fragmentary, and filtered through perspectives that make objectivity nearly impossible. The primary account comes from John White himself, who kept detailed records of his voyages and left behind a narrative of his final, failed return to the colony in 1590. His account is invaluable, but it is also the testimony of a man in anguish, a man describing the disappearance of his own family, and it must be read with that grief in mind. We have also the writings of Richard Hakluyt, the great Elizabethan compiler of voyage narratives, who collected and published the accounts of the Roanoke expeditions as part of his monumental work on English exploration. Hakluyt was not a witness, he was an editor, and his choices about what to include and exclude shaped how subsequent generations understood the colony. His work is essential, but it is a construction, not a window. From the earlier 1585 expedition, we have the detailed observations of Thomas Harriot, a brilliant mathematician and naturalist who accompanied that voyage and produced the first systematic English description of the Carolina Algonquian peoples, their agriculture, their beliefs, their ways of life. Harriot's account is often sympathetic, sometimes condescending, always filtered through the assumptions of an educated Elizabethan Protestant who believed that English civilization represented a higher form of human organization. We have also the watercolors of John White himself, who served as the expedition's artist before becoming the colony's governor, images of indigenous villages, fishing practices, ceremonies, plants, and animals that remain among the most important visual records of pre-contact Native American life on the Atlantic coast. What we do not have are the voices of the colonists themselves, beyond White's official records. We do not have letters home, diaries, personal accounts of daily life in the settlement. We do not have the testimony of Eleanor Dare, White's daughter, or her husband Ananias, or any of the other Wenefine souls who were left behind when White sailed for England. Their thoughts, their fears, their plans, their final decisions, all of this is lost to us. We can only infer, reconstruct, imagine within the constraints of what the evidence permits, and we emphatically do not have the voices of the Carolina Algonquian peoples, the Croatoan, the Socotan, the Wappamiak, the Roanoke, whose lands the English had invaded and whose responses to that invasion shaped everything that followed. Their perspectives exist only as shadows in the English accounts, glimpsed through the distorting lens of colonial observation. What they made of these strangers who arrived on their shores with strange tools and strange diseases and strange assumptions about land and property and sovereignty. This we can never fully know. Modern archaeology has added fragments to the picture. Excavations on Hatteras Island, the location of the Croatoan settlement, have uncovered English artifacts mixed with indigenous materials in contexts suggesting prolonged contact and possible integration. A site on the mainland, dubbed Site X by researchers, has yielded similar evidence, but archaeology speaks in objects, not words. It can tell us that English goods ended up in certain places. It cannot tell us how the people who carried them felt about the journey. What we can say with confidence is that 117 people disappeared. What we cannot say, what 4 centuries of investigation have failed to determine, is what happened to them after the last English ship vanished over the eastern horizon. The story of Roanoke begins not on a sandy island off the Carolina coast, but in the corridors of power in Elizabethan England, where a queen without an heir played a dangerous game of survival against the most powerful empire on earth. Elizabeth Tudor had been on the throne of England for nearly 3 decades by the mid-1580s. She had inherited a kingdom that was poor by European standards, Protestant by recent conversion, and surrounded by Catholic powers that regarded her as an illegitimate heretic whose assassination would be a service to God. She had survived plots, rebellions, and the constant pressure to marry and produce an heir. She had navigated the treacherous waters of European diplomacy with a combination of intelligence, caution, and calculated ambiguity that drove her advisors to distraction and her enemies to fury. And she had watched, for all those years, as Spain grew fat on the gold and silver of the Americas. The Spanish had been in the New World for nearly a century by the time Elizabeth came to power. They had conquered the Aztec and Incan empires, extracted unimaginable quantities of precious metals from the mines of Mexico and Peru, established colonies from Florida to Chile, and claimed dominion over territories so vast that their full extent was not yet mapped. The treasure fleets that carried this wealth back to Spain, the famous flota system, were the lifeblood of the Habsburg Empire, funding armies in the Netherlands, diplomacy across Europe, and the construction of the greatest navy the world had ever seen. England had no colonies in the Americas. England had no share in the precious metals that were transforming the European economy. England was, by comparison to Spain, a small island kingdom on the periphery of power, rich in wool and fish and not much else. And Elizabeth knew, Her advisors knew, her merchants and sailors and adventurers knew, that if England was to survive and prosper in the coming century, it would need to challenge Spain's monopoly on the New World. This was not merely a matter of greed, though greed certainly played its part. It was a matter of strategic survival. The wealth flowing into Spain was being used to fund a Catholic crusade against Protestant Europe. Spanish armies were fighting in the Netherlands, attempting to crush the Dutch revolt. Spanish gold was subsidizing plots against Elizabeth's life. The Spanish king, Philip II, had been married to Elizabeth's predecessor, the Catholic Mary Tudor, and he regarded himself as having a legitimate interest in the English succession. The threat was existential. And so England turned to the sea. The English challenge to Spanish dominance took many forms in the 1570s and 1580s. There were the voyages of Francis Drake, who circumnavigated the globe plundering Spanish ships and ports, returning to England with holds full of stolen silver and a reputation that made him a hero at home and a pirate abroad. There were the raids on Spanish treasure fleets, the support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, the quiet encouragement of anything that might weaken the Spanish grip on the Americas. And there were attempts to establish English colonies in the New World, not to find gold necessarily, but to create bases from which English ships could operate, settlements that would produce commodities Spain did not control, outposts that would project English power into territories Spain claimed but did not effectively occupy. The man who became the architect of this colonial vision was Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was perhaps 40 years old in the mid-1580s, tall, handsome, eloquent, ambitious, possessed of a sharp intelligence and a gift for self-promotion that made him simultaneously one of the most admired and most resented figures at Elizabeth's court. He had risen from modest West Country gentry to become the Queen's favorite through a combination of military service, personal charm, and what contemporaries recognized as a genuine brilliance. He wrote poetry, studied navigation and chemistry, sponsored scientific expeditions, and dreamed on a scale that most of his contemporaries found either inspiring or alarming. He had never been to the Americas himself. He never would go, at least not to North America. But he understood, perhaps better than any other Englishman of his generation, that the future of English power lay across the Atlantic, and he was determined to plant England's flag in the New World before age or politics or the fortunes of war took away his opportunity. In 1584, Elizabeth granted Raleigh a royal charter authorizing him to discover, search, find out, and view such remote heathen and barbarous lands, countries, and territories not actually possessed of any Christian prince or inhabited by Christian people. The language was careful. It avoided direct challenge to Spanish claims while leaving open the possibility of settlement anywhere Spain had not yet effectively occupied. And Spain, for all its vast claims, had not occupied the Atlantic coast of North America north of Florida. Raleigh moved quickly. That same year, he dispatched 2 ships under the command of Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow to reconnoiter the coast and identify a suitable location for a colony. They sailed through the Caribbean, turned north along the coast of Florida, and eventually found their way through the barrier islands to a large, sheltered body of water the Spanish had not charted. They landed on an island the local inhabitants called Roanoke, explored the surrounding waters, made contact with the indigenous peoples, and returned to England with glowing reports of a land of abundance, mild climate, and friendly natives eager to trade. The reports were, in certain respects, accurate. The coastal region of what is now North Carolina was indeed rich in fish and game, blessed with a temperate climate, and inhabited by Algonquian-speaking peoples whose initial response to the English visitors was cautious hospitality. But the reports were also shaped by what Raleigh wanted to hear, and by what Amadas and Barlow understood their mission to require. They were selling a vision, and the vision they sold was of a land ripe for English taking. Elizabeth was sufficiently pleased to grant the newly claimed territory a name, Virginia, in honor of the Virgin Queen herself. It was an act of imperial imagination, a declaration of ownership over lands that belonged to peoples who had not been consulted and would not have agreed. The name would stick, eventually migrating north to the Chesapeake Bay region, where English colonization would eventually succeed. but in these early years it referred to the entire stretch of coast from Florida to Newfoundland, and especially to the sandy, wind-swept islands where Amadas and Barlow had planted their flags. The first Roanoke colony arrived in 1585, and it was not the colony of farmers and families that would follow 2 years later. It was a military expedition, a garrison of soldiers and adventurers under the command of Sir Richard Grenville and the day-to-day leadership of Ralph Lane, a professional soldier with experience in Ireland. Their mission was not to build a permanent settlement, but to establish a base, explore the interior, search for gold or a passage to the Pacific, and demonstrate that England could project power into Spain's claimed sphere of influence. John White was among this first expedition, serving as the official artist and mapmaker. So was Thomas Harriot, the mathematician and naturalist who would produce the most detailed Elizabethan account of the Carolina Algonquian peoples. They spent the year observing, recording, mapping. White producing the watercolors that would become famous, Harriot compiling the notes that would become his brief and true report of the newfound land of Virginia. But the soldiers who made up the bulk of the colony were not observers. They were men trained in the brutal methods of Elizabethan warfare, many of them veterans of the campaigns in Ireland, where English forces had employed scorched earth tactics against Gaelic populations. They had been told to expect easy friendship with the indigenous peoples, and when that friendship proved conditional, when the promised supplies of corn did not materialize, when the local inhabitants made clear that English presence was welcome only on their own terms, the soldiers responded with violence. The details of what happened in 1585-1586 are fragmentary, but the outline is clear enough. Relations with the Roanoke people and their neighbors deteriorated rapidly. The English demanded food that the indigenous communities could not spare without risking their own survival. When the food was not provided, the English took it by force. A silver cup went missing, and the English retaliated by burning a village. An indigenous leader named Wingina, who had initially welcomed the strangers, grew increasingly hostile as he recognized that they had come not as guests, but as conquerors. In June of 1586, Ralph Lane led a preemptive strike against Wingina's village, killing the chief and several of his followers. The English claimed they had uncovered a plot against the colony. Perhaps they had. Perhaps they had simply created enemies where none had existed before. Either way, the violence guaranteed that any future English presence on Roanoke would begin under a shadow of suspicion and fear. A few weeks after Wingina's death, Sir Francis Drake arrived at Roanoke with a fleet fresh from raids on Spanish Caribbean ports. The colonists, demoralized, underfed, and aware that they had made enemies of the peoples on whose cooperation their survival depended, chose to abandon the settlement and return to England with Drake. When Grenville arrived with a supply fleet shortly after, he found the colony deserted. He left a small garrison of 15 men to hold the English claim, then sailed for home. Those 15 men were never seen again. This was the situation that John White faced when he agreed to lead the second Roanoke colony in 1587. He was not a soldier, he was an artist, a gentleman, a man who had observed the first colony's failures and believed he understood what had gone wrong. The new colony would be different. It would be built on families, not garrisons. It would include women and children, people with stakes in the future, people who would put down roots and build relationships rather than extract what they could and leave. It would be located not on Roanoke Island, with its poisoned relationships and its vulnerable position, but further north in the Chesapeake Bay, where the land was said to be richer and where no blood had yet been spilled. The colonists who signed on for this venture were not soldiers of fortune or desperate adventurers. They were craftsmen and farmers, merchants and their families, people seeking opportunity in a new land. Among them were White's own daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare, a London bricklayer whose skills would be needed to build the permanent structures the colony would require. There were at least 17 women and 11 children, including 2 boys named Thomas Smart and George Howe, who would grow up, or not, in the wilderness of the New World. They sailed from Plymouth in May of 1587, 3 ships carrying 117 colonists and their hopes across the Atlantic. The crossing took 2 months, and when they made landfall on the Carolina coast, everything began to go wrong. The plan had been clear. Stop briefly at Roanoke to collect the 15 men Grenville had left behind, then proceed north to the Chesapeake Bay. But the pilot of the fleet, a Portuguese navigator named Simon Fernandez, had other ideas. Fernandez had his own agenda. Contemporary accounts suggest he was more interested in privateering against Spanish ships than in nursemaiding a colony. And when the fleet reached Roanoke in late July, he announced that the season was too advanced to continue north. The colonists would be put ashore here at Roanoke, whether they liked it or not. White protested. The colonists protested. It made no difference. On July 22, 1587, the men, women, and children of the second Roanoke colony stepped onto the sandy soil of an island where English hands had already spilled English and indigenous blood, where the burned remnants of villages testified to English violence, where the memory of Wingina's murder was fresh in the minds of every survivor. The 15 men Grenville had left were gone. The colonists found a single skeleton, probably one of the garrison, killed by indigenous warriors in retaliation for the events of the previous year. The fort was overgrown, the buildings collapsed, deer grazing in what had been the streets. The colonists began the work of rebuilding, knowing that they were now trapped in a place they had never intended to stay, surrounded by peoples who had every reason to hate them. Within a week, the consequences of the first colony's violence made themselves felt. A colonist named George Howe, the father of young George Howe, Jr., wandered 2 miles from the settlement to catch crabs in the shallow water of Albemarle Sound. He was alone and unarmed. A group of indigenous warriors, probably Roanoke survivors or their allies, found him there and killed him, striking him with 16 arrows and crushing his head with a wooden club. His son was now fatherless, and the colonists were now terrified. White attempted diplomacy. He sent envoys to the Croatoan people on Hatteras Island, 50 miles to the south, who had maintained friendly relations with the English throughout the previous expedition. The Croatoan leader Manteo, who had twice traveled to England and served as translator and intermediary between the two cultures, agreed to help. A meeting was arranged with the other indigenous groups of the region, an attempt to repair the damage done by Lane's expedition. The meeting never happened. The indigenous nations failed to appear at the appointed time and place, and White, perhaps under pressure from frightened colonists, perhaps misreading the situation, perhaps simply panicking, decided to interpret their absence as hostile intent. On a night in early August, English soldiers attacked a village thought to be harboring Howe's killers. They attacked in darkness, killing several inhabitants before discovering that they had struck not an enemy village, but a settlement of Croatoans who had been there gathering crops from the abandoned fields. The village's inhabitants had been friends, not enemies, and now several of them were dead or wounded. The English relationship with the indigenous peoples of Roanoke was now damaged beyond any easy repair. They had killed their enemies, and then they had killed their friends. They were trapped on an island where they had no allies, facing a winter without adequate supplies in a land they did not understand. And in the midst of this gathering disaster, a small miracle occurred. On August 18, 1587, exactly 3 years before John White would return to find the colony vanished, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. The child was healthy. White recorded her birth with evident joy, describing her as the first English child born in the Americas, a symbol of the permanent presence England hoped to establish in the New World. They named her Virginia, after the land that Elizabeth had claimed, and named for herself, after the Queen whose ambitions had brought them all to this place. Virginia Dare was 9 days old when her grandfather sailed for England. The colonists had begged him to go. Their situation was desperate, low on supplies, surrounded by hostile or suspicious peoples, facing a winter that could easily kill them. They needed reinforcements, provisions, tools, weapons, everything that a colony required to survive its first precarious years. Someone had to return to England to organize the relief expedition, and the colonists believed that White, as governor, was the only man whose authority and credibility could ensure that help would actually arrive. White resisted. He did not want to leave his daughter, his newborn granddaughter, his fellow colonists. He knew the risks of an Atlantic crossing, knew that ships were lost every year to storms and pirates and Spanish warships. He knew that once he left, anything might happen before he returned. But the colonists were insistent, and they may have been right. White was the colony's best hope of getting the help it needed, and staying would not have improved their odds of survival. On August 27, 1587, John White boarded the flyboat for England. The colonists crowded the shore to watch him go. He carried with him letters, reports, and a promise to return as quickly as possible with everything the colony needed to survive. He also carried, though he could not have known it, the last image he would ever have of his family. Eleanor standing on the sand with Virginia in her arms, Ananias beside her, both of them growing smaller as the ship caught the wind and turned toward the open Atlantic. He expected to be gone for a few months. He would be gone for 3 years. The world John White returned to in November of 1587 was a world at war, or nearly so. The long-anticipated conflict between England and Spain was finally reaching its crisis. Philip II had decided that the Protestant heresy could be exterminated only by invasion, and his commanders were assembling the greatest naval force ever seen in European waters. The Spanish Armada, 130 ships, 30,000 men, carrying an army capable of conquering England, would sail in the summer of 1588. Elizabeth's government responded with everything at its disposal. Every ship in England was called into service. Merchant vessels were armed and drafted into the royal fleet. Private vessels that might otherwise have carried colonists and supplies to the Americas were forbidden to leave English waters. The nation's entire naval capacity was being mobilized to meet the existential threat approaching from Spain. And John White's relief expedition for Roanoke was caught in the middle of this mobilization. He tried. Throughout the winter of 1587 and of 1588 and into the spring, he worked desperately to assemble ships and supplies for the colony. Raleigh, still committed to the venture despite the chaos, helped where he could. By April of 1588, White had secured 2 small ships, not the fleet he had hoped for, but something. He loaded them with provisions and set sail for Roanoke. He never made it. Somewhere in the Atlantic, the captain of White's ship decided that privateering was more profitable than colony supply. Instead of continuing to Roanoke, he attacked a larger vessel, a spectacularly poor decision, as it turned out, since the other ship was better armed and crewed. White's ship was boarded, looted, and badly damaged. The supplies intended for the colony ended up in the hands of French pirates or at the bottom of the sea. White himself was wounded in the fighting, and the battered remnants of his expedition limped back to England with nothing to show for their efforts. By the time White recovered from his wounds, the Armada had arrived in the English Channel. For 2 weeks in July and August of 1588, the fate of Protestant Europe hung in the balance as the English fleet harassed and harried the Spanish galleons, as fireships scattered the Armada at Gravelines, as storms and hostile seas did what English guns could not quite accomplish. The Armada was broken, scattered, driven around Scotland and Ireland, wrecked on rocky coasts from the Hebrides to Kerry. Perhaps 15,000 Spanish sailors and soldiers died. The invasion was over. But White's relief expedition was not. It could not begin. The aftermath of the Armada crisis consumed English resources for months. Ships needed repairs, sailors needed rest. The threat of a second invasion kept the government cautious about releasing vessels for Atlantic voyages. Throughout 1589, White continued his efforts to reach Roanoke, and throughout 1589, circumstances continued to conspire against him. We have his letters from this period, or some of them, and they reveal a man increasingly desperate, increasingly aware that time was running out. He wrote to Richard Hakluyt, the great chronicler of English exploration, describing his frustrations and his fears for the colonists. He begged Raleigh for help. He approached merchants, sea captains, anyone who might have the means to carry him back across the Atlantic. Again and again, he was refused, delayed, put off. The colony was too remote, the venture too unprofitable, the risks too high. No one would invest in a relief expedition for 100-odd colonists stranded on an island that had never produced any returns. Finally, in March of 1590, White secured passage aboard a privateer fleet bound for the Caribbean. The ships were sailing to plunder Spanish commerce, not to resupply Roanoke, but their captain agreed to stop at the colony on the return voyage. It was not ideal. White would arrive with no supplies beyond what he could carry personally, no reinforcements, no tools or weapons. but it was the only opportunity he had been offered in nearly 3 years. He took it. The voyage west was slow, the privateering operations prolonged. It was August before the fleet turned north toward the Carolina coast, and August 15th before they sighted the barrier islands where Roanoke lay. White had been away from his family for 36 months. On the evening of August 17th, the ships anchored near Roanoke Island, and White saw the smoke rising from the northern end. He ordered the trumpets sounded, the guns fired, English songs sung across the water. If the colonists heard, they would know that rescue had finally come. The sounds rolled across the waves and into the darkening forest. No one answered. The next morning, White went ashore. He found the settlement empty. The houses were gone, not burned but carefully taken down, the timbers removed as if the colonists had decided to relocate and had dismantled their buildings to carry the wood with them. The palisade still stood, or most of it, and carved into one of the entrance posts was the word Croatoan. On a tree nearby, the letters CRO had been cut, as if someone had begun to carve the same message and been interrupted. White had left specific instructions with the colonists before his departure. If they were forced to move, they were to carve their destination on a tree or post. If they left under duress or attack, they were to add a cross above the name, a signal of distress. There was no cross above Croatoan. White interpreted this as a hopeful sign. The colonists had left, but not in fear, not fleeing enemies, not dying. They had gone to Croatoan Island, 50 miles to the south, where Monteo's people lived, where friendly relations had been maintained throughout. If he could reach Croatoan, he might find his daughter and granddaughter waiting for him, alive and well, living among the people who had been the English colony's only real friends, but he could not reach Croatoan. The storm that night was fierce, driving the ships out to sea, snapping anchor cables, threatening to dash the vessels on the treacherous shoals that lined the Carolina coast. The next morning, the fleet's captain refused to risk his ships further. They would not search Croatoan. They would not investigate the coast. They were going home. White pleaded. He offered everything he had, promised anything he could think of. The captain was unmoved. The privateering voyage had been profitable, and the captain had no intention of losing his profits or his ships, searching for a colony that had probably been dead for years. On August 28, 1590, the fleet turned east and sailed for England. John White left his family for the second time, and this time he knew he was leaving forever. He was an old man by the standards of his age, without resources or influence, caught up in events far larger than any individual could control. The Spanish threat had consumed England's attention at exactly the moment when Roanoke needed help. By the time the threat had passed, the colony was beyond rescue. White died around 1593, probably in Ireland, certainly in obscurity. He never learned what happened to those 117 colonists he had left behind. He never learned whether his daughter survived, whether his granddaughter grew up, whether any of them had lived to see his failed return. The last we hear from him is a letter to Richard Hakluyt, written in 1593, in which he commends the colonists' souls to the merciful help of the Almighty, whom I most humbly beseech to help and comfort them, according to his most holy will and their good desire. It is a prayer without an answer, a hope without a resolution. The colonists had vanished, and the silence they left behind would endure for centuries. The question that has haunted historians, archaeologists, and curious amateurs ever since is simple to state and nearly impossible to answer. What happened to them? The evidence White found on Roanoke Island in 1590 offers a starting point, but only barely. The houses had been dismantled, not destroyed. The colonists' belongings, armor, tools, chests of goods, had been buried and then dug up, their contents scattered. The word Croatoan had been carved deliberately, without a cross of distress. Whatever happened to the colonists, it does not seem to have been a sudden catastrophe, not a massacre, not a raid in the night. They had time to take down their houses. They had time to carve a message. They made decisions, even if we cannot know what those decisions were based on. The most obvious interpretation of the evidence is also the most hopeful. The colonists went to Croatoan Island, where Monteo's people lived. They may have abandoned Roanoke voluntarily. seeking the protection and resources that the Croatoan could provide. They may have been running low on food, or they may have faced renewed threats from the indigenous groups their predecessors had alienated. Moving to Croatoan would have made sense under such circumstances. The Croatoan were friendly, their island was more fertile than Roanoke, and the colonists knew that White would eventually return and would understand the message they left behind. If this interpretation is correct, then the colonists survived, at least for a time. They lived among the Croatoan, learned their ways, perhaps intermarried and had children. When White failed to search Croatoan, and when no other English expedition came to look for them, they would have faced a choice: maintain their English identity in isolation or integrate fully into the indigenous community that had taken them in. Given the circumstances, integration would have been the path of survival. There is some evidence for this interpretation, though none of it is conclusive. In the early decades of the 17th century, when English colonists finally established permanent settlements in Virginia, at Jamestown in 1607 and later, they heard reports from indigenous informants about white people living in the interior, about people with gray eyes and fair hair among the native populations, about stone houses unlike anything the indigenous peoples had built before. These reports intrigued the Jamestown colonists, who sent expeditions to search for the lost Roanoke survivors, but the expeditions found nothing definitive. The stories remained stories. Modern archaeology has added tantalizing fragments to this picture. On Hatteras Island, the modern name for the island where the Croatoan lived, excavations have uncovered English artifacts from the late 16th century, mixed with indigenous materials in contexts suggesting prolonged contact. A fragment of a rapier, English pottery, a gunlock, personal items that would have belonged to colonists rather than explorers. These objects did not arrive through brief trade encounters. They were deposited over time, in layers that suggest English goods, and possibly English people, were present among the Croatoan for years or decades after 1587. On the mainland, at a site researchers have designated Site X, similar finds have emerged: English pottery and metalwork, again mixed with indigenous artifacts, in an area that corresponds to a location marked on a map that John White made before his departure. A map that, under multispectral imaging, revealed a hidden patch covering what appears to have been a symbol. Some researchers believe this indicates a planned fallback position, a site on the mainland where the colonists intended to go if Roanoke proved untenable. If so, then the colony may have split, some going south to Croatoan, others going west to Site X, dispersing into the landscape in small groups that would have been nearly invisible to later English searchers. But none of this evidence tells us what happened to the individual colonists, whether they lived long lives among their indigenous hosts, whether they died of disease or starvation or violence, whether Virginia Dare saw her 5th birthday or her 10th or her 20th. The artifacts are fragments, and fragments cannot speak. The alternative theories are darker. Perhaps the colonists did not leave Roanoke voluntarily. Perhaps they were driven out or killed by the indigenous groups they had wronged. The violence of the 1585-1586 expedition had created enemies, and the accidental killing of friendly Croatoans in 1587 may have cost the colonists their last remaining allies. Alone on an island, surrounded by hostile peoples, without supplies or reinforcements, they may have simply been overwhelmed, yet there is no evidence of a massacre. White found no bodies, no graves, no signs of violence. If the colonists had been killed on Roanoke Island, there should have been some trace, bones at the very least, or the remains of a defensive battle. The absence of such evidence does not prove that no violence occurred, but it makes a sudden massacre less likely. Disease is another possibility. The English brought European pathogens to the Americas: smallpox, measles, typhoid, diseases to which the indigenous peoples had no immunity. But the same diseases could have struck the colonists themselves, especially if their food supplies ran low and their bodies weakened. A plague that killed most of the colonists might have left the survivors few enough to be absorbed into indigenous communities without maintaining a distinct identity. And there is the sea. The colonists had a small boat, and they may have attempted to sail home or to sail north to the Chesapeake Bay, their original destination, and been lost in the crossing. The barrier islands of the Carolina coast are among the most dangerous waters on the Atlantic seaboard, treacherous with shoals and sandbars, subject to sudden storms and powerful currents. A boat full of desperate colonists attempting to reach safety could easily have been swallowed by the Atlantic without leaving any trace at all. The truth is that we do not know. 4 centuries of investigation have produced theories, hypotheses, fragments of evidence, but no certain answers. The 117 colonists of Roanoke vanished into a continent that was, from the English perspective, vast and unknowable, and the silence they left behind has never been fully broken. What we do know is that their disappearance had consequences that rippled outward through the following centuries. Roanoke was a warning about the costs of colonization, about the difficulty of sustaining settlements far from home in lands already occupied by peoples who had not been consulted and had no reason to cooperate. It was also a demonstration that ordinary people, men, women, children, families, would take the risk of crossing an ocean to build new lives in unknown lands. The next English attempt at American colonization at Jamestown in 1607 would succeed where Roanoke had failed, but only barely, and only after its own catastrophes and starvations and massacres. And the Roanoke colonists themselves, the people, not the lesson, they vanished into history, leaving behind names in a ship's manifest, a word carved into wood, and questions that have no answers. John White's granddaughter was named Virginia. She was born on August 18, 1587, the first English child born in the Americas. She was 9 days old when her grandfather last saw her. She may have lived for decades among the Croatoan or other indigenous peoples, or she may have died in infancy, or she may have been lost at sea with the rest of the colonists. We do not know. We cannot know. The sources are silent, and the silence is absolute. What remains is the word Croatoan, still legible after 4 centuries, still asking a question that has no answer. The colonists carved it into wood, intending it as a message, a signpost, a promise that they could be found. They were never found. The message remains, and the people are gone, and the pines along the Carolina coast still whisper in the wind, the way they whispered 400 years ago when English families walked among them and then walked away, into a future we cannot see. The wind that whispers through those Carolina pines carries more than memory. It carries the weight of a question that has haunted every generation since John White stood on that empty shore and read the word his daughter may have carved with her own hands. To understand what the colonists might have done, where they might have gone, why they left no clearer trace, we must first understand the world they vanished into, the physical and human geography of the coastal Carolinas in the late 16th century. A landscape that was anything but empty, anything but simple, anything but safe. The outer banks of what is now North Carolina form one of the most distinctive coastlines in North America. They are a chain of narrow barrier islands, some barely a few hundred yards wide, stretching in a long arc from the Virginia border southward toward Cape Lookout. Between these islands and the mainland lies a complex system of sounds: Albemarle Sound, Pamlico Sound, Croatan Sound, shallow bodies of brackish water, maze-like in their channels and inlets, treacherous to navigate, teeming with fish and waterfowl and the insects that breed in marshland. The islands themselves are sand and scrub, shaped and reshaped by every hurricane, every nor'easter, every spring tide. What is solid ground one year may be underwater the next. What is a navigable inlet in one decade may silt up and close in the next. Roanoke Island sits inside this labyrinth, sheltered from the open Atlantic by the barrier islands, but separated from the mainland by miles of sound. It is roughly 12 miles long and 3 miles wide, composed of sandy soil, pine forest, and marsh. In 1587, it was accessible only by boat, small boats, draft shallow enough to navigate the sounds, or larger vessels that could anchor in the deeper channels and send pinnaces ashore. For the English colonists, the island's position was both asset and liability. It offered some protection from Spanish warships, which would have difficulty navigating the shallow and poorly charted waters, but it also meant isolation, dependence on boats for any contact with the mainland, vulnerability to anyone who controlled the waterways. The indigenous peoples who had lived in this region for thousands of years understood its geography in ways the English could not. They knew which channels flooded at what tides, which islands offered fresh water, which forests held game, which fishing grounds were richest in which seasons. Their canoes, carved from single cypress logs and paddled with remarkable skill, could navigate waters that would strand English pinnaces on sandbars. They had built villages throughout the sounds and along the mainland coast, villages connected by water routes and trade networks that extended deep into the interior. The English called all these peoples Indians and often conflated them into a single undifferentiated category. But the reality was far more complex. The region around Roanoke was home to multiple distinct peoples, the Croatoan, the Secatan, the Wapamiak, the Roanoke, and others, each with their own territory, their own leadership, their own relationships with neighboring groups. Some of these peoples had been trading partners, some had been enemies, some had been cautiously neutral. The violence of the 1585-1586 expedition had disrupted these relationships catastrophically, but it had not eliminated the peoples themselves or erased the political complexity of the region. Understanding this complexity is essential to understanding what may have happened to the colonists. The word Croatoan was not carved randomly. It referred to a specific place and a specific people. Croatoan Island, now called Hatteras Island, lay about 50 miles south of Roanoke, one of the barrier islands that form the Outer Banks. The Croatoan people who lived there had been, by the accounts of the earlier English expedition, among the friendliest of the local indigenous groups. Monteo, the indigenous man who had traveled to England twice and served as translator and intermediary for the colonists, was himself Croatoan. His mother was a leader of his people. If the colonists had decided to relocate, voluntarily, systematically, as the careful dismantling of their houses suggests, the Croatoan would have been an obvious destination. They had a guide who knew the way. They had, in Monteo's family, a potential host. But Croatoan Island was not the only possibility. The colonists' original destination had been the Chesapeake Bay, roughly 100 miles to the north. The Chesapeake offered what Roanoke did not: deep harbors accessible to ocean-going ships, more fertile soil, larger rivers leading into the interior. If the colonists had decided that Roanoke was untenable, too exposed, too isolated, too haunted by the violence of the previous expedition, they might have attempted to reach the Chesapeake on their own, either by land or by small boat. It would have been a difficult journey, especially for a group that included children and pregnant women, but it would not have been impossible. Indigenous peoples had been traveling these routes for centuries. There is a fragment of evidence, thin, contested, impossible to verify, that suggests some colonists may have reached the Chesapeake region. In 1607, when the Jamestown colonists arrived in Virginia, they heard stories from local indigenous peoples about English survivors living in the interior. Captain John Smith, the Jamestown leader who was as skilled at self-promotion as he was at survival, reported that Powhatan, the paramount chief of the Tidewater Virginia peoples, had told him that white people were living among a group called the Chesapeake on the southern shore of the bay. Smith also reported that Powhatan claimed to have ordered the massacre of these English and their indigenous hosts shortly before the Jamestown colonists arrived, conveniently eliminating any witnesses or rivals just as a new group of English appeared. Smith's account has been doubted by historians for 4 centuries. He was a notorious embellisher, and his reports frequently served his own interests. The story of the massacre may have been an attempt to intimidate the Jamestown colonists, or it may have been a fabrication by Smith himself to explain the absence of the Roanoke colonists without suggesting that peaceful integration with indigenous peoples was possible. But the story cannot be entirely dismissed. If some of the Roanoke colonists had reached the Chesapeake Bay and established themselves among the local peoples, Powhatan would have had reason to view them as a threat, not because they were English, but because they represented an alternative power center within his sphere of influence. Indigenous politics in the region were complex and often violent. The elimination of a mixed English-indigenous community on his southern border would have been consistent with Powhatan's broader strategy of consolidating power. The difficulty is that we have no independent confirmation of Smith's account. The Jamestown colonists launched no sustained search for Roanoke survivors. They were too busy trying to survive themselves, starving, dying of disease, fighting with the Powhatan Confederacy. If any Roanoke colonists or their descendants were still alive in the early 17th century, the English made no recorded effort to find them. And if Powhatan's story was true, then they were already dead, killed in a massacre that left no archaeological trace and no indigenous oral tradition that has survived to the present day. This silence, the silence of the sources, the silence of the survivors, the silence of the land itself, is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Roanoke mystery. 400 years have passed. Thousands of people have searched for the colonists. Modern archaeology has grown sophisticated enough to detect individual seed grains in excavated soil, to identify European copper alloys by their chemical signature, to map buried foundations with ground-penetrating radar. And yet the colonists remain hidden, their bones unfound, their fate unconfirmed. Part of the difficulty is the sheer size of the territory they might have occupied. The coastal plain of the Carolinas and Virginia stretches for hundreds of miles, covered in dense forest, crossed by rivers and swamps, dotted with what were once indigenous villages now long since abandoned. If the colonists dispersed, some to Croatoan, some to the Chesapeake, some to other destinations we do not know, the archaeological signature of each group would be diluted, scattered, mixed with indigenous material in ways that are difficult to distinguish. A handful of English artifacts in an indigenous site might represent trade goods, or they might represent an English woman married to an indigenous man, or they might represent the remnants of a colony. The artifacts cannot tell us. What the artifacts have revealed in recent decades is tantalizing but inconclusive. On Hatteras Island, the former Croatoan island, archaeologists have found English artifacts from the late 16th century. A rapier handle, fragments of European pottery, a writing slate, gun flints, copper farthings. These objects were found in contexts that suggest close interaction between English and indigenous peoples, not a separate English settlement, but English goods integrated into an indigenous community. The simplest explanation is that these objects came from trade or from salvage of shipwrecks, but they might also represent something more. Roanoke colonists living among the Croatoan, their goods gradually dispersing into the material culture of their hosts. Even more intriguing is Site X, a location on the mainland of North Carolina about 50 miles from Roanoke Island. In 2012, researchers studying John White's maps noticed that a patch on one of the maps seemed to conceal something beneath it. Using modern imaging technology, they discovered that underneath the patch was a small symbol, a star shape that might have marked a location. Archaeologists began investigating the corresponding site on the ground and found English artifacts from the late 16th century. Fragments of a Delftware drinking vessel, pieces of Surrey, Hampshire borderware, food storage jars of a type common in the Elizabethan period. These were not trade goods, but domestic items. Objects used in households, in daily life, in the kind of sustained habitation that a colony would require. Site X is inland, away from the coast, away from both Roanoke and Croatoan. If colonists settled there, they would have been following a strategy of dispersal, moving into the interior where they might find more resources, more space, more distance from the conflicts that had plagued their coastal settlement. The land along the Albemarle Sound was fertile, watered by rivers, forested with hardwoods. Indigenous peoples had been farming there for centuries. A small group of English, especially one that included colonists with agricultural skills, might have been able to establish themselves in such a landscape, particularly if they had indigenous help, indigenous knowledge, indigenous spouses. The question of intermarriage is unavoidable. When English colonists arrived in Virginia in the following decades, they reported encountering indigenous peoples with European features, gray eyes, lighter skin, the ability to speak some English. These reports may have been wishful thinking, projections of English identity onto peoples who were in fact entirely indigenous. Or they may have been accurate observations of mixed heritage individuals, the children and grandchildren of Roanoke colonists who had survived by integrating into indigenous communities. The best documented of these reports comes from John Lawson, a surveyor and naturalist who traveled through the Carolina interior in 1701, more than a century after the Roanoke colonists disappeared. Lawson encountered a group of indigenous peoples on Hatteras Island who told him that several of their ancestors were white people and could talk in a book, as we do, the truth of which is confirmed by gray eyes being found frequently amongst these Indians and no others. Lawson also noted that these people claimed to be descendants of English colonists who had come in times past and intermarried with their ancestors. Lawson's account has been treated with caution by historians. He was writing more than 100 years after the events he described, relying on oral traditions that had passed through multiple generations. Indigenous peoples had been interacting with Europeans, English, Spanish, French, for more than 2 centuries by the time Lawson arrived. Gray eyes might have come from any number of sources: sailors shipwrecked on the coast, traders who stayed longer than they intended, captives taken in raids, missionaries who went native. The claim of descent from English colonists might have been a way for indigenous peoples to establish a connection with the powerful English settlers who were increasingly dominating the region, a political strategy rather than a genealogical fact. But the claim cannot be dismissed entirely. The Croatoan people of Hatteras Island had been the colonists' closest indigenous allies. Manteo had been their intermediary, their guide, their friend. If the colonists had gone to Croatoan Island, as the carved word suggests they intended, and if they had remained there, they would have lived among Manteo's people for decades. They would have eaten the same food, worn similar clothing, learned the Algonquian language. Their children would have grown up bilingual, bicultural, moving between worlds. By the time those children had children of their own, the line between English and Croatoan might have become impossible to draw. This possibility, that the colonists survived by becoming something other than English, by disappearing into the indigenous population rather than maintaining a separate identity, is one of the most compelling theories of the Roanoke mystery. It explains the absence of bodies. It explains the absence of graves. It explains the careful dismantling of the settlement, the orderly departure, the single word carved as a destination rather than a cry for help. It is consistent with the evidence from Hatteras Island, from Site X, from the reports of gray-eyed Indians in the centuries that followed. And it is, in its own way, a form of survival. Not the survival that John White hoped for, not the continuation of an English colony on English terms, but survival nonetheless, the continuation of life, the persistence of descendants, the mingling of blood and language and culture that is the oldest story of human migration. There is something troubling about this theory, too. It places the burden of the mystery's resolution on peoples who cannot speak for themselves, the Croatoan and other indigenous communities who were devastated by European colonization in the centuries that followed. Whatever oral traditions they may have preserved about the English colonists were largely lost as their populations collapsed from disease and displacement, as they were pushed off their lands, as their languages faded and their communities dispersed. We are asking the descendants of the colonized to explain the fate of the colonizers, and we are doing so across a silence that colonization itself created. The alternative theories, massacre, disease, drowning, are grimmer but perhaps simpler. They do not require us to imagine the colonists as anything other than victims, do not require us to trace the complexities of indigenous politics, do not require us to grapple with the possibility that English families chose to become something other than English. They offer closure of a sort. The colonists are dead, their bones dissolved into the sandy soil of the Carolina coast, their stories ended in the year after White's departure or the year after that, finished before they could truly begin. But the evidence does not clearly support these theories either. No mass grave has been found. No signs of epidemic disease have been detected at the Roanoke site. No oral traditions of massacre have survived among the indigenous peoples of the region, or, if they have not been shared with the historians and archaeologists who have sought them. The colonists might have died violently, might have been killed by disease, might have been lost at sea. But we have no proof. What we have instead is ambiguity, uncertainty, the maddening incompleteness of the historical record. The colonists vanished into a continent that swallowed them whole, and we are left to reconstruct their fate from fragments. A word carved in wood, a handful of artifacts, reports from travelers a century later, the silence of the land itself. There is one more piece of evidence, though it is evidence of absence rather than presence. In the years after the Roanoke colony failed, the English did not give up on American colonization. They sent more expeditions, established more settlements, learned, slowly, painfully, through repeated failures, how to survive on the other side of the Atlantic. Jamestown, founded in 1607, nearly failed as catastrophically as Roanoke. Its colonists starved, fought with indigenous peoples, died by the hundreds. Only the arrival of supplies from England, the discovery of tobacco as a profitable crop, and the establishment of more stable relations with local peoples allowed the colony to survive. And at Jamestown, the colonists asked about Roanoke. They were instructed to search for survivors. They were told to investigate rumors of English people living in the interior. But they never conducted a systematic search. They never sent sustained expeditions to the sites the Roanoke colonists might have reached. They recorded rumors, reported conversations, speculated in letters home, but they never followed through. The search for the lost colonists was, in practical terms, abandoned almost before it began. Why? The most generous interpretation is that the Jamestown colonists were simply too desperate, too busy trying to survive their own catastrophe, to spare the resources for a search that might prove futile. They had heard that the colonists were dead, killed by Powhatan, or dispersed beyond recovery. They may have believed that any survivors had long since assimilated into indigenous communities and would be impossible to identify. The practical challenges of searching the vast Carolina and Virginia coastline, with hostile indigenous peoples in many areas and no reliable maps, would have been immense. But there is a less generous interpretation as well. The Roanoke colonists, if they had survived by integrating with indigenous peoples, would have represented an awkward problem for the English colonial project. They would have been living proof that English people could survive in America without English institutions, without English authority, without the entire apparatus of colonial control that Jamestown was trying to establish. They would have been English subjects who had chosen, or been forced, to become something else, to live outside the boundaries of English law and English identity. Finding them might have raised uncomfortable questions about what English colonization actually meant, about who had the authority to define its terms, about whether ordinary people had the right to make their own accommodations with the peoples whose lands they occupied. It is easier to mourn the lost colonists as victims than to grapple with them as agents. It is easier to imagine them dead, massacred, or starved, or drowned, than to imagine them alive, changed, transformed into something that does not fit neatly into the categories of English history. The mystery of Roanoke endures in part because it is useful, because it allows us to tell a story about colonial vulnerability and sacrifice without asking too many questions about colonial violence and adaptation. The lost colonists can be mourned without being understood. They can be remembered without being found. John White spent the last years of his life in Ireland, far from the Carolina coast, far from the granddaughter he never saw again. He had tried to return, had spent everything he had on the attempt, had been thwarted by war and weather and the indifference of those who might have helped him. In one of his final letters written around 1593, he described his sorrowful journey back to Roanoke in 1590, the storm that drove him away from Croatoan Island before he could search for survivors, his failure to learn anything about his family's fate. The letter is the last direct record we have of him. He fades from history shortly afterward, an old man who had seen more of the world than most of his contemporaries, who had painted the peoples and landscapes of America with extraordinary skill, who had led 117 people across the Atlantic and never learned what became of them. His paintings survive. The watercolors he made during the 1585 expedition, careful, detailed, ethnographically precise renderings of indigenous peoples, their villages, their clothing, their rituals, are among the most valuable documents of 16th century America. They show us what the English saw when they first arrived, a world that was alien and rich and dangerous and beautiful, a world that would soon be transformed beyond recognition by the forces the English unleashed. The people in White's paintings look out at us across 4 centuries, their faces calm, their postures dignified, their world still intact. Within a few generations, many of their descendants would be dead, their villages abandoned, their lands occupied by the descendants of the colonists who brought disease and violence and an insatiable hunger for territory. The Roanoke colonists were part of that transformation, even if they did not survive to see it through. They were among the first wave of English settlers, the advance guard of an invasion that would eventually span a continent. Their failure did not discourage the English. It educated them. The next expedition, to Jamestown, would be led by men who had studied Roanoke's mistakes. They would bring more supplies, more soldiers, more ships. They would establish a fortified position, make treaties with local peoples, develop cash crops that could justify the enormous expense of colonization. They would succeed where Roanoke had failed, and their success would set in motion the dispossession of the indigenous peoples who had lived on this land for millennia. This is the larger story into which the Roanoke colonists vanished. They were not anomalies or outliers. They were early casualties of a process that would reshape the world. Their fate, whatever it was tied to the fate of everyone who lived on both sides of the Atlantic in those turbulent decades when Europe reached across the ocean and grasped a continent it did not understand. The colonists who stepped onto Roanoke Island in July 1587 were not heroes or villains. They were ordinary people caught up in forces far larger than themselves, trying to make lives in a place that had not invited them, dealing with consequences they could not foresee. And somewhere in that vast green continent, in the forests and sounds and rivers of the Carolina coast, their story continued, or ended, in ways we cannot see. The word Croatoan points us toward them, but it cannot take us all the way. The rest is silence and conjecture and the wind through the pines. What happened next, or rather, what did not happen, is itself a kind of story. A story told in absences and silences, in the things that should have occurred but didn't, in the slow accumulation of years during which no one came, no ships arrived, no rescue mounted. The colonists waited for John White, and while they waited, they had to survive. We do not know how they did this. We do not know if they did this, but we can reconstruct the parameters of their existence, the constraints within which any survival would have had to occur, the choices that would have faced them as the weeks stretched into months and the months into years. The historical record is silent, but the land itself speaks. The climate speaks, the biology speaks, and what they tell us is that the colonists' situation, already precarious when White left, would have deteriorated rapidly. The food supplies they had brought from England were never sufficient for a permanent settlement. They were meant to sustain the colonists through the first season while crops were planted and local food sources identified. But the colonists arrived in late July, too late to plant and harvest before winter. Whatever stores they had brought across the Atlantic, salt pork, hardtack, dried peas, beer, would have been depleted within months, not years. They needed to supplement their provisions almost immediately, and the options for doing so were limited. The waters around Roanoke Island were rich with fish. The Outer Banks supported enormous populations of drum, mullet, and bass. The Sounds teemed with oysters, clams, and crabs. A competent fishing operation could have sustained the colony indefinitely, but the English were not, by and large, competent fishermen. They came from a culture that viewed fishing as peasant labor, beneath the dignity of gentlemen. Many of the colonists were craftsmen, merchants, farmers accustomed to raising livestock and grain. They did not know how to build weirs or set nets in unfamiliar waters. They did not know which species were safe to eat or when they ran. The indigenous peoples of the region had developed these techniques over thousands of years. The English would have to learn them from scratch, or learn them from the Croatoan, or starve. The same problem applied to agriculture. The colonists knew how to grow wheat and barley, familiar European crops that required plowed fields in temperate conditions. The soil of Roanoke Island was sandy, acidic, unsuitable for European grains. The local peoples grew maize, beans, and squash. The the three sisters of indigenous agriculture, using techniques adapted to the specific conditions of the coastal plain. These crops could have sustained the colonists, but only if they knew how to cultivate them, when to plant, how to prepare the soil, how to store the harvest. The learning curve was steep, and they were starting it in late summer with winter approaching. Hunting offered another possibility, but again, the English faced a skills gap. The forests of the Carolina coast supported deer, bear, turkey, and small game in abundance. Indigenous hunters knew these woods intimately, the trails, the watering holes, the seasonal movements of prey. English hunters, accustomed to chasing deer through manicured parklands with packs of hounds, would have found the dense, tangled vegetation of the coastal forest nearly impenetrable. Their firearms, while terrifying to people who had never encountered them, were cumbersome, slow to reload, and useless in wet weather. The matchlock muskets of the 1580s required a lit fuse to fire. Rain extinguished the fuse, humidity fouled the powder. A bow in skilled hands was faster, quieter, and more reliable. Every survival option, in other words, led back to the same conclusion. The colonists needed help from the indigenous peoples of the region. They could not survive alone. They did not have the skills, the knowledge, or the time to develop them independently. Either they would forge alliances with their neighbors, learn from them, trade with them, perhaps eventually merge with them, or they would die. This was the fundamental reality that John White left behind when he sailed for England. 117 people, including infants and pregnant women, stranded on a sandy island with dwindling supplies, surrounded by peoples whose previous experience of the English had included kidnapping, murder, and the destruction of entire villages. Whatever happened to the colonists, it happened within this framework. Every theory about their fate must account for these constraints. The most enduring theory, the one that the carving of Croatoan seems to support, is that the colonists abandoned Roanoke Island and moved to live among the Croatoan people on what is now Hatteras Island. This theory has several points in its favor. The Croatoan, led by a man named Manteo, had been among the friendliest of the local peoples to the English. Manteo himself had traveled to England twice, had learned English, had been baptized as a Protestant Christian, and had been named Lord of Roanoke by John White in a ceremony just weeks before White's departure. He had every reason to maintain good relations with the colonists, and they with him. The geography also supports this theory. Hatteras Island lies roughly 50 miles south of Roanoke Island, an easy journey by boat along the protected waters of Pamlico Sound. The Croatoan village there was an established community with food supplies, shelter, and the accumulated knowledge needed to survive on the outer banks. If the colonists faced starvation on Roanoke, moving to Croatoan Island would have been the logical choice. It was close, it was friendly, it offered resources they lacked, but the theory also raises questions. Why would the colonists abandon their settlement entirely? Why not leave a larger contingent behind to wait for White's return while a smaller group sought help from the Croatoan? Why dismantle the houses so carefully? White noted that the buildings had been taken down, not destroyed. If they were simply relocating 50 miles down the coast? And what happened after they arrived? If they merged with the Croatoan, why did subsequent English expeditions find no trace of them? The answers to these questions may lie in the political situation of the coastal peoples. The Croatoan were not an isolated group living in peaceful abundance. They were part of a complex network of alliances, rivalries, and hierarchies that stretched across the coastal plain and into the interior. The most powerful entity in this network was the Secatan Confederacy, a loose alliance of villages along the Pamlico and Neuse rivers. Beyond them, further inland, lay even larger polities, the Roanoke, the Waipamiak, the Mangoak, peoples with populations in the thousands and territories spanning hundreds of miles. The Croatoan were relatively small, relatively weak, situated on the vulnerable barrier islands at the edge of this world. They needed allies. They needed protection. And the English, for all their strangeness, represented a potential source of both. The logic of this situation may have shaped what happened to the colonists in ways we cannot directly observe. If the Croatoan accepted the English refugees, they would have had to integrate them somehow, Find places for them in the social structure, assign them roles, perhaps marry them into the community. 117 people was not a trivial number. The Croatoan village on Hatteras Island may have numbered only a few hundred people itself. Absorbing the colonists would have been a major undertaking, one that transformed both groups. And transformation, once begun, does not stop. The English who joined the Croatoan, if they did, would have had to adapt to survive. They would have learned the language. They would have adopted local customs, worn local clothing, eaten local food. Their children, growing up in this mixed community, would have been culturally indigenous even if they retained some English ancestry. Within a generation or two, the colonists would have been nearly unrecognizable to their countrymen. They would have become, in the eyes of later English visitors, simply another group of native people living along the Carolina coast. This is the scenario that some historians call benign absorption, the idea that the colonists survived by vanishing into the indigenous population, their English identity gradually diluted and eventually lost. It is an optimistic theory, one that imagines a peaceful resolution to the colony's crisis, but it has a shadow side that must also be acknowledged. The process of absorption would not have been symmetrical. The colonists needed the Croatoan far more than the Croatoan needed them. This imbalance of power would have shaped every interaction. The English had metal tools, which were valuable. They had firearms, which were valuable but temperamental. They had knowledge of European ways that might prove useful in future dealings with other Europeans. But they also had mouths to feed, skills that were largely irrelevant, and a history of violence that made them dangerous guests. The Croatoan would have been taking a significant risk by accepting them. What did they demand in return? What obligations did the colonists incur? Were there conflicts, negotiations, compromises that we cannot see because no one who witnessed them left a record? The word Croatoan tells us where the colonists intended to go. It tells us nothing about what happened when they got there, or how long they stayed, or whether they were welcomed or merely tolerated, protected or exploited, integrated or kept separate. And there is another possibility, darker still, that must be mentioned even though it cannot be proven. The colonists may have sought refuge with the Croatoan and been refused, or they may have been accepted initially and then expelled or killed or sold to other groups as captives. Indigenous societies, like all societies, had their internal politics, their factions, their power struggles. Monteo's friendship with the English does not mean that all Croatoan were equally friendly. Someone who had lost a relative in the violence of 1585 and 1586 might have had very different feelings about harboring English refugees. The sources do not tell us whether such tensions existed, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The silence of the record conceals as much as it reveals. This brings us to the broader political situation of the coastal region in the years after White's departure, a situation that may have determined the colonists' fate more than any of their own choices. The Secatan peoples, who dominated the mainland opposite Roanoke Island, had reason to hate the English. The 1585 expedition under Ralph Lane had murdered their chief Wingana in a preemptive strike. Lane had suspected, perhaps correctly, perhaps not, that Wingana was planning an attack on the English fort. He invited Wingana to a parley under false pretenses and then killed him and his principal advisors. The Secatan never forgot this treachery. By 1587, when White's colonists arrived, the memory was still fresh, the wounds still raw. George Howe's death, just days after the colonists landed, showed that the danger was real. Howe was killed while crabbing alone in shallow water, struck down by warriors who had been watching the colonists' movements and waiting for an opportunity. The attackers were never identified with certainty, but they were almost certainly from one of the Secatan villages, perhaps from Dasamunkapus, the village closest to Roanoke Island, where Wingina had once ruled. The killing was a message. The English were not welcome. They would never be safe. The colonists' response to Howe's death was revealing. They asked Monteo to arrange a meeting with the people of Dasamunkapeux, hoping to negotiate peace or at least establish communication. When the Dasamunkapeux failed to respond within the appointed time, the colonists launched a night raid on the village with Monteo as their guide. They attacked at dawn, killing at least one person before they realized their mistake. The village was occupied not by their enemies, but by friendly Croatoan who had been gathering the autumn harvest. The Dasemunkapush had fled days earlier, leaving their fields and their enemies to reap the crops. The English had attacked their allies by accident. This incident reveals the colonists' situation with terrible clarity. They were surrounded by people whose intentions they could not read, whose movements they could not predict, whose languages they did not speak. They were capable of violence, but not of precision. They could strike, but they could not know who they were striking or whether they were making things better or worse. The night raid on Dasemunkapush, even though it ended in apologies and explanations, must have damaged their relationship with the Croatoan. It demonstrated that the English could not be trusted to distinguish friend from enemy, ally from adversary. How long before they made another mistake, a worse one? The colonists' military weakness was equally apparent. 117 people, including women and children and elderly members, could not defend themselves against a coordinated attack by the Sokotan Confederacy. They had firearms, but not enough. They had walls, but not strong ones. The fort they inherited from the 1585 expedition was designed for a military garrison, not a mixed community of families. A determined assault at night or a prolonged siege that cut off their access to water and food would have overwhelmed them within days. Their only real protection was the water that surrounded Roanoke Island, the sounds and shallows that made surprise attack difficult, and the fragmentation of their enemies, who were not united enough to mount a coordinated campaign. This fragmentation could not be counted on forever. Indigenous politics were fluid, alliances shifted, leaders rose and fell. A chief who opposed war with the English in 1587 might be replaced by one who favored it in 1588. The colonists had no way to monitor these changes, no intelligence network, no way to know when their window of relative safety might close. Every season that passed without relief from England was another season in which the balance of power might tip against them. We do not know whether it did. We do not know whether the colonists faced a military threat that forced them to flee, or whether they left Roanoke Island voluntarily to seek better prospects elsewhere. But we can say that their survival depended on factors entirely outside their control: the internal politics of peoples they barely knew, the decisions of leaders whose names they did not know, the accidents of death and succession and alliance that shaped indigenous society in ways invisible to European observers. And then there is disease. The epidemiological catastrophe that Europeans unleashed upon the Americas is one of the most important facts about the colonial period and one of the hardest to see in real time. The English who landed at Roanoke carried pathogens to which they themselves were largely immune: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, but which were devastating to peoples who had no prior exposure. The first English expeditions to the Carolina coast in 1584 and 1585 triggered outbreaks of illness among the local populations that killed significant numbers and terrified the survivors. Thomas Harriot, the scientist who accompanied the 1585 expedition, recorded indigenous accounts of villages where people began dying shortly after English visits, dying very fast and many in short space. Harriot interpreted these deaths as evidence of English superiority, perhaps even divine favor. The indigenous peoples, he noted, had no explanation for the sickness except supernatural causes. They could not see the germs. They could not understand transmission. They knew only that contact with the English brought death, and that the English themselves remained healthy. Some concluded that the English had the power to kill at a distance, invisibly, through magic, or the favor of powerful spirits. Others wondered whether the English were not quite human, whether they might be ghosts or revenants, or beings from another world entirely. These beliefs shaped every interaction between the colonists and their indigenous neighbors. They created fear, which could manifest as hostility or as deference depending on circumstances. They created suspicion, as people wondered whether English friendship was simply a prelude to English sorcery. And they created opportunities for manipulation, as English leaders learned that their reputation for deadly magic could be exploited to intimidate potential enemies. But disease was a double-edged weapon, one that the English could not control. The same epidemics that weakened indigenous resistance also destabilized indigenous society, killing leaders and disrupting the networks of alliance and trade on which the English depended for survival. A chief who had been friendly to the English might die of smallpox and be replaced by someone hostile. A village that had provided food and guidance might be abandoned when its population collapsed below viable levels. The very forces that gave the English their terrifying power also made the world around them unpredictable, chaotic, impossible to navigate with any confidence. The colonists of 1587 inherited this epidemiological situation without necessarily understanding it. They knew that sickness had followed earlier English visits. They may not have known why, or that they themselves were carriers. They landed on Roanoke Island, bringing with them the invisible seeds of further outbreaks, further deaths, further disruption to the indigenous communities on which their survival depended. Whether disease played a direct role in their fate, whether they succumbed to illness themselves, or whether their indigenous hosts died and left them without support, we cannot say. But the possibility must be part of any honest reckoning with what happened. The same is true of environmental factors. The late 1580s were difficult years climatically in the Tidewater region. Tree ring data from cypress trees in the area reveals that 1587 marked the beginning of the most severe drought in 800 years of recorded climate history, a mega drought that lasted through 1589 and beyond. This drought would have devastated local agriculture, reduced game populations as animals sought water elsewhere, dried up the springs and streams on which both English and indigenous peoples depended for drinking water. It would have created conditions of scarcity in which the colonists' presence became intolerable, in which there simply was not enough food or water to go around, in which sharing with strangers became impossible. The drought may explain why the colonists left Roanoke Island. There was no permanent freshwater source on the island itself, only shallow wells that tapped the groundwater lens beneath the sandy soil. In normal years, these wells were adequate. In a severe drought, they may have gone brackish or dry. The colonists would have faced a choice: stay and die of thirst, or leave and seek fresh water elsewhere. Croatoan Island to the south, or the mainland to the west, offered better options. The carved word Croatoan may record their decision, a message to white that they had gone where they could survive. But drought does not explain everything. It does not explain why no trace of the colonists was ever found on Croatoan Island, despite multiple searches over the following decades. It does not explain why later English colonists at Jamestown, who mounted expeditions specifically to find Roanoke survivors, came back with only rumors and fragments. It does not explain the persistent stories of English people living among the indigenous peoples of the interior, stories that circulated for generations, but that could never be confirmed. The truth is that the colonists may have done several things at once or in sequence. They may have sent one group to Croatoan while another tried to reach the Chesapeake Bay, their original destination. They may have split into smaller parties as conditions deteriorated, each seeking its own path to survival. They may have been absorbed, killed, dispersed, and forgotten in ways that varied from group to group and person to person. History does not always resolve into a single narrative. Sometimes the ending is plural, multiple threads disappearing in different directions, none of them traceable to a final terminus. This is what makes Roanoke so frustrating and so compelling. We want to know. We want a solution, a revelation, a moment when the mystery dissolves and we finally understand. But the evidence resists synthesis. Every theory explains some facts and leaves others unexplained. Every scenario has its strengths and its fatal weaknesses. The colonists vanished into a situation so complex, so contingent, so dependent on factors we cannot observe that reconstruction may simply be impossible. We are left with pieces that do not fit together, edges that do not align, a puzzle that cannot be completed because too many pieces were never recorded. And perhaps that is the most honest conclusion, not that we know what happened, not even that we will someday know, but that knowing has limits. The past does not preserve itself for our convenience. The past does not owe us answers. 117 people lived and made choices and faced consequences, and the traces they left behind are not sufficient to reconstruct their story with certainty. What we can do, what the historian must do, is hold open the space of uncertainty, resist the temptation to close the narrative prematurely, acknowledge what we do not know while still honoring what we do. The colonists were real. Their suffering was real. Their choices, whatever they were, had reasons that made sense to them at the time. And so we return to the island, to the empty site, to the carved word that has haunted American memory for 4 centuries. We return not to solve the mystery, but to sit with it, to understand what the disappearance meant to those who came after, and to trace the long shadow that Roanoke has cast across the subsequent history of English colonization in the Americas. When John White sailed away from Roanoke in August of 1590, forced by weather and circumstance to abandon his search for the colonists, he was not merely leaving behind a mystery. He was leaving behind his daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia, his son-in-law Ananias. He was leaving behind people he had eaten with, prayed with, argued with, governed. The abstraction of 117 lost colonists obscures the specific and irreducible nature of his loss. These were not statistics. They were people whose faces he knew, whose voices he could hear in memory, whose absence would follow him for the rest of his days. White returned to England a broken man. The records of his final years are sparse, but what we know suggests a life diminished, contracted by grief. He lived for a time in Ireland, on one of Raleigh's estates in County Cork, far from the centers of power and influence where his earlier career had flourished. He wrote letters, attempted to organize return expeditions, petitioned anyone who might listen. Nothing came of these efforts. The Queen had other priorities. Raleigh had other schemes. The investors who had funded the Roanoke venture had written off their losses and moved on to more promising opportunities. In one of his surviving letters, White reflects on the fate of the colonists with a kind of exhausted resignation. He commits their souls to God and the mercy of Providence. He notes that he had done everything in his power to save them, and that his failure was not for lack of trying. There is no anger in the letter, no bitterness toward those who had prevented his return. There is only a vast and terrible weariness, the weariness of a man who has outlived his purpose. White died sometime around 1593, though the exact date and place of his death are unknown. He left behind no grave that history has preserved, no monument, no final resting place that future generations could visit. In this, he mirrors the colonists themselves, present in the historical record for a brief moment, then vanishing into silence, his ending as obscure as theirs. But his art survived. The watercolors that John White painted during his time in the New World, images of the indigenous peoples, the flora and fauna, the landscapes and settlements of the Carolina coast, became some of the most reproduced and influential images of early American history. They were engraved by Theodore de Bry and published throughout Europe, shaping how the Old World imagined the new for generations to come. The Secatan village that White painted, with its longhouses and ceremonial spaces, its gardens and gathering places, became the template through which Europeans visualized indigenous American life. The individual portraits he made, of priests and hunters, women and children, elders in their regalia, preserved faces that would otherwise be utterly lost to time. There is something almost unbearably poignant in this. White failed to save the colonists. He failed to discover their fate. He died in obscurity, mourning a daughter and granddaughter whose bones he would never find. But he succeeded in preserving something that no one else could have preserved, a visual record of the world his colonists had entered, the peoples they had encountered, the landscape that had swallowed them. The mystery of Roanoke is inseparable from the images that White created. We see the world into which the colonists vanished because White showed it to us before they disappeared. His watercolors show us what the colonists themselves would have seen: the smoke rising from Secatan cook fires, the elaborate tattoos on Algonquian bodies, the fishing weirs and canoes, the corn growing in carefully tended fields. They show us a world that was neither wilderness nor wasteland, neither empty nor savage, but inhabited, cultivated, organized according to principles and practices that the English could barely comprehend. When we look at White's paintings, We are looking through the eyes of the man who led the colonists into that world and then watched helplessly from across an ocean as they vanished into it. The fate of Roanoke cast a long shadow over subsequent English attempts at colonization. When the Jamestown colony was established in 1607, 20 years after the Roanoke settlers arrived, and 17 years after White found the site abandoned, the memory of the lost colony was very much alive in the minds of the new arrivals. The Virginia Company, which funded and organized the Jamestown venture, explicitly instructed its colonists to search for survivors of the Roanoke expedition. The possibility that English men, women, and children might still be living somewhere in the interior of Virginia, perhaps among the indigenous peoples, perhaps in some hidden settlement, haunted the imaginations of those who came after. The instructions given to the Jamestown colonists reveal the depth of this preoccupation. They were ordered to inquire among the native peoples about Europeans who might be living in the region. They were told to look for signs of English habitation, English tools, English people. The Virginia Company had not forgotten Roanoke. The investors and organizers who planned the Jamestown expedition lived with the possibility, however remote, that somewhere in the vast and unmapped interior of the continent, the lost colonists or their descendants might still survive. And so, the Jamestown colonists asked questions. They sent expeditions. They listened to rumors and interpreted signs. What they heard over and over was fragmentary and contradictory. Stories that seemed to confirm the colonists' survival and stories that seemed to record their destruction, stories that located survivors in one direction and stories that pointed in another. The most detailed account comes from William Strachey, secretary of the Jamestown colony, who compiled reports from various sources about the fate of the Roanoke settlers. According to Strachey, the paramount chief Powhatan himself told the English that he had ordered the killing of the Roanoke survivors shortly before the Jamestown colonists arrived. Powhatan allegedly claimed that the English people had been living among a group called the Chesapeake, and that he had attacked and destroyed this group as part of his consolidation of power in the region. This account is both tantalizing and deeply problematic. If true, it would mean that at least some of the Roanoke colonists survived for 2 decades, living among indigenous communities in the Chesapeake Bay region, before being killed in intertribal warfare, just as a new generation of English colonists arrived to look for them. The timing would be almost unbearably cruel. Survivors within reach, destroyed just before they could be found. But there are reasons to doubt Strachey's account. Powhatan had strategic motivations for telling the English this story, whether or not it was true. By claiming to have destroyed the previous group of English settlers, he was simultaneously demonstrating his power and sending a warning. He could do the same to the Jamestown colonists if they displeased him. The story served his interests regardless of its accuracy. Moreover, Strachey's account contradicts other reports circulating at the same time. Some Jamestown colonists heard stories of English people still alive in the interior. Men with English clothes, women with English features, stone houses built in the English style. John Smith himself recorded rumors of survivors, though he never managed to confirm them through direct contact. The reports were persistent enough that the Virginia Company continued to instruct its agents to search for the lost colonists well into the 1610s. The most intriguing of these reports concerned gray-eyed people living among the indigenous nations of the Carolina interior. For decades after the Roanoke disappearance, English and later American observers noted that some native peoples in the region had physical features that seemed to suggest European ancestry. Lighter skin, gray or blue eyes, hair that was brown rather than black. These observations were often casual, unreliable, filtered through the prejudices and assumptions of their observers. But they accumulated. They formed a pattern. They pointed toward a possibility that has never been definitively confirmed or refuted, that at least some of the Roanoke colonists survived by integrating into indigenous communities, that their descendants lived on in the bloodlines of peoples who remembered nothing of their English origins. The Lumbee people of North Carolina have maintained a particularly persistent connection to this possibility. The Lumbee, a state-recognized tribe whose members have lived in Robeson County for centuries, have long claimed descent from the Roanoke colonists. Their oral traditions speak of English ancestors who intermarried with local indigenous peoples. Early European observers noted that the Lumbee spoke English before any documented contact with English settlers, that they used English names, that they practiced Christianity in forms that seemed to predate missionary activity in the region. Some of the family names among the Lumbee, Dare, Sampson, Barry, Cooper, match names on the list of Roanoke colonists. The Lumbee theory has never been proven to the satisfaction of most historians. The evidence is circumstantial, the oral traditions difficult to verify, the chain of connection from 1587 to the present impossible to document with certainty. DNA studies have produced inconclusive results. The genetic admixture of the Lumbee is complex, reflecting centuries of interaction among indigenous European and African populations, and isolating a specific Roanoke contribution is methodologically challenging, if not impossible. But the theory persists, in part because it offers something that the other theories do not, a kind of hope. If the colonists were absorbed into indigenous communities, if their descendants are still alive today, then the story does not end in death and disappearance. It ends in survival, adaptation, continuity. The 117 colonists did not vanish. They transformed. They became something different, something new, something that endured. Their blood still flows in living veins. This is a powerful narrative, and its power has shaped how Americans have remembered and memorialized the lost colony for generations. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, became an iconic figure in American memory. Her brief and undocumented life transformed into a symbol of innocence, promise, and loss. Paintings and statues imagined her as a beautiful white woman, grown to adulthood in some forest paradise, the embodiment of a certain kind of Anglo-American identity that needed an origin story. The commemoration of Virginia Dare took particularly troubling forms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when her image was appropriated by nativist and white supremacist movements as a symbol of endangered white womanhood. The lost colony became, in the hands of these ideologues, a story about white people threatened by savage others, about the fragility of civilization in the face of barbarism. Virginia Dare's name was attached to eugenicist pamphlets and anti-immigration tracts, her hypothetical fate invoked to justify racist policies and attitudes. This appropriation reveals something important about how historical mysteries function in collective memory. The gaps in the evidence, the spaces where we do not know, become screens onto which later generations project their own fears and fantasies. Roanoke has been made to mean different things to different people at different times. A cautionary tale about the dangers of colonial overreach, a romantic tragedy of doomed settlers, a white supremacist allegory of racial threat, an indigenous story of absorption and survival. The mystery does not resolve these competing interpretations, it enables them. Because we do not know what happened, we can imagine whatever we need. The archaeological record has complicated these imaginings without resolving them. Beginning in the 1990s, a series of excavations on Roanoke Island, Hatteras Island, and the mainland have uncovered fragments that seem to connect to the lost colonists, though none have provided definitive answers. On Hatteras Island, the location of the Croatoan people who gave the colony its final mysterious message, archaeologists have discovered English artifacts mixed with indigenous materials at a site occupied by the Croatoan during the period when the colonists would have arrived. A small copper signet ring, probably used for sealing documents or correspondence, bears a lion or horse passant that links it to the Kendall family of Devon. And there was a colonist named Master Kendall listed among the 1587 expedition. Gunflint fragments, pieces of English pottery, a slate writing tablet, iron tools. These objects appear in strata that date to the late 16th century, mixed with Croatoan ceramics and shell beads. The interpretation of these finds is contested. The artifacts could represent trade goods acquired by the Croatoan from the English during the periods of peaceful contact. They could represent salvage collected from abandoned sites after the colonists departed, or they could represent colonists themselves, English people living among the Croatoan, using their English tools alongside newly learned indigenous techniques, adapting to a different way of life. The slate writing tablet is particularly evocative. The act of writing, of committing thoughts to a surface that could preserve them, was so central to English identity and self-understanding that a colonist who possessed a writing slate would not have given it up lightly. If an English person was living among the Croatoan and still using a slate to write, what were they writing? Messages to loved ones who would never read them? Records of daily life in a world their fellow English could not imagine? Prayers? Confessions? We will never know. The slate preserves no text, only the scratches of use that suggest someone wrote upon it, once, before the words were erased and the surface wiped clean. The mainland investigations have been equally suggestive and equally inconclusive. At a location approximately 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, near the confluence of the Chowan River and Salmon Creek, archaeologists have explored a site that appears on a map John White created, a map that, under modern imaging techniques, revealed a hidden patch covering a symbol that may represent a fort. This site, designated Site X, has yielded English artifacts from the late 16th century. Pieces of Surrey, Hampshire borderware, a type of pottery manufactured in England and common on English colonial sites. Fragments of Nuremberg tokens, small brass counters used for accounting, a fragment of a rapier hilt. The Site X discoveries suggest the possibility that some colonists attempted to establish themselves on the mainland, perhaps seeking the better agricultural land and fresh water that Roanoke Island could not provide. The location would have been accessible by boat from Roanoke, following the sounds and rivers that penetrate deep into the North Carolina interior. A group of colonists fleeing drought or conflict could have reached this site and attempted to build a new settlement. But Site X has also yielded evidence of indigenous occupation, predating and postdating the period of potential English presence. The English artifacts appear in a matrix of indigenous materials, ceramics, stone tools, faunal remains, that suggests a more complex picture than simple English settlement. Perhaps colonists lived here briefly before being absorbed, killed, or moved on. Perhaps they traded with indigenous people who occupied the site and left their goods behind when transactions were complete. Perhaps the artifacts were brought here by indigenous people who had scavenged them from abandoned English sites or from English people they had encountered elsewhere. Every discovery raises as many questions as it answers. Every artifact that seems to point toward the colonists also admits of alternative explanations. The evidence accumulates, but does not converge. We have more pieces of the puzzle than we had 50 years ago, but the puzzle still refuses to resolve into a single coherent image. And perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps the expectation of a single answer is itself a kind of historical hubris, a refusal to accept the irreducible complexity of the past. The colonists were not a unified group making unified decisions. They were individuals and families, factions and friendships, people with different skills and different temperaments and different levels of commitment to the colonial project. When the crisis came, whatever the crisis was, they would not have responded as a single body. They would have argued. They would have split. They would have made different choices. Some may have gone to Croatoan, seeking shelter with indigenous allies. Some may have gone inland, toward the mainland sites that archaeology is beginning to reveal. Some may have tried to sail south to the Chesapeake, their original destination. Some may have stayed on Roanoke Island longer than others, hoping against hope that White would return. Some may have been killed in conflicts we know nothing about. Some may have died of disease or starvation. Some may have been adopted into indigenous families and communities, their children growing up speaking Algonquian languages and knowing nothing of the cold island their grandparents had left behind. The word Croatoan, carved on a wooden post, may record a decision made by the majority. But majorities have dissenters. Consensus has holdouts. A message carved for a governor who might return is not a census of every colonist's fate. It is a marker, a sign, a gesture toward information that it cannot fully contain. What we know with certainty is this: the colonists existed. They sailed across the Atlantic with their tools and their seeds and their hopes. They stepped onto a shore where no Englishwoman had ever stood before. They built houses and made their lives and faced difficulties that we can only partially reconstruct. And then they made choices, or had choices forced upon them, and those choices led to outcomes that the historical record did not preserve. They were not symbols. They were not lessons. They were people who found themselves in circumstances they could not control, facing options they could not have anticipated, making decisions with consequences they could not foresee. They did what people have always done. They tried to survive. Some of them may have succeeded. Some of them certainly failed. The boundaries between survival and failure may have been blurry, contingent, impossible to trace. John White came back for them 3 years too late and found only silence and a carved word. He stood on the shore where his daughter had stood, where his granddaughter had been born, and he had no way to know what had happened to them. The not knowing was his burden. It became America's inheritance. The colonists left behind no journals that survived, no letters that reached their destinations, no testimony that the future could hear. They left behind only the carved word and the traces that archaeology continues to uncover, piece by patient piece. They left behind questions that 4 centuries of inquiry have not answered. But they also left behind something else, something harder to articulate. They left behind the proof that it was possible. Before Roanoke, no English family had attempted to settle permanently in the Americas. Before Roanoke, the New World was a place for soldiers and sailors, explorers and pirates, men who came to take what they could and return home. After Roanoke, the possibility existed, however fragile, however uncertain, that English people could build lives across the Atlantic, could raise families on American soil, could plant themselves in the earth of a continent that owed them nothing. The Jamestown colonists who came 20 years later knew about Roanoke. They knew that 117 people had tried and vanished. They knew the risks. They came anyway. And in this sense, the Roanoke colonists succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined, even as they failed beyond anything they could have feared. They succeeded by demonstrating that the attempt was possible. They failed by vanishing into the silence that swallowed their testimony. And between those two truths, the success and the failure, the possibility and the silence, lies the space where the Roanoke colony continues to exist, 4 centuries after the last colonist made the last choice that history did not record. The word carved into the post at Roanoke has become, over the centuries, perhaps the most analyzed single artifact in American historical archaeology. Croatoan. 7 letters cut into wood, presumably by a blade, presumably by one of the colonists, presumably at a time when they believed John White might return to find it. Every element of that sentence contains an assumption. The assumptions may be correct, they may not be. The carving itself no longer exists. The wooden post rotted away centuries ago, and we know it only through White's testimony in his report to Richard Hakluyt. We cannot examine the cut marks to determine what tool was used. We cannot study the weathering to estimate when the carving was made. We cannot analyze the wood itself to learn anything about the tree it came from or the soil it grew in. We have only White's word that the carving existed and White's transcription of what it said. This is the fundamental condition of Roanoke scholarship. Nearly everything we know comes filtered through a single man's testimony, recorded at a moment of profound personal trauma, preserved through a printing process that introduced its own distortions, and interpreted by 4 centuries of readers who brought their own assumptions to the text. White saw what he saw. He recorded what he thought was important. He failed to record things that might have seemed obvious to him but would be invaluable to us. He had no way to know what questions we would want to ask. He had no obligation to answer them. The carving said, Croatoan, without a cross or other distress symbol. White understood this to mean that the colonists had gone to Croatoan Island and had done so voluntarily, without immediate duress. This interpretation seems reasonable, given the agreement he says he made with the colonists before his departure, that they would carve their destination on a tree or post and add a cross if they were leaving under force or in danger. But we cannot verify that this agreement existed. We cannot know whether all the colonists were aware of it, whether they remembered it correctly 3 years later, or whether circumstances might have prevented them from following it, even if they wanted to. A colonist being marched away by hostile captors would not have the opportunity to carve a message. A colonist fleeing in panic might not have the presence of mind. A colonist dying of disease might not have the strength. The absence of a distress symbol might indicate the absence of distress, or it might indicate the absence of opportunity to signal distress. The carving tells us something. It does not tell us everything. It probably does not tell us most of what we would want to know. Croatoan Island, modern Hatteras Island, was home to the Croatoan people, an Algonquian-speaking group who had maintained relatively friendly relations with the English across both the 1585 and 1587 expeditions. Monteo, the indigenous man who had traveled to England and served as translator and intermediary, was Croatoan. When he was baptized and given the title Lord of Roanoke, he was returning to his own homeland, his own people, bringing with him whatever complicated feelings must accompany the experience of watching foreigners claim your territory while simultaneously making you a lord of it. The Croatoan represented the best possibility for English survival, a neighboring nation that had not been alienated by the violence of the Lane expedition, that had personal connections to the colonists through Monteo's relationships, and that might have been willing to shelter English refugees if circumstances required. The logic that the colonists went to Croatoan is compelling. It explains the carving. It aligns with what we know about indigenous colonial relations. It offers a plausible path to survival, with the colonists integrating into Croatoan communities or establishing a satellite settlement under their protection. The archaeological evidence from Hatteras Island, the English artifacts mixed with indigenous materials, the signs of cultural exchange, is consistent with this theory without conclusively proving it. But compelling logic is not evidence. The Roanoke colonists might have carved Croatoan on the post to indicate their intended destination and then never reached it. Ships sink, storms kill, plans fail. A group setting out for Croatoan Island might have been intercepted by hostile forces, caught in a hurricane, swept out to sea by currents, or simply died on the journey from accident or illness. The carving might record an intention rather than an outcome. We cannot know. Or the colonists might have gone to Croatoan initially and then moved elsewhere. The carving might record their first destination, but not their final one. 3 years is a long time. Circumstances change. The community that welcomed English refugees in 1587 might have grown tired of feeding them by 1589. A drought that made Roanoke Island untenable might have affected Croatoan Island as well. The colonists might have moved once, twice, 3 times, following opportunities or fleeing dangers that the archaeological record has not preserved. Croatoan might be the first word in a sentence that was never completed. The mystery multiplies the longer you look at it. Every answer generates new questions. Every theory opens new gaps. The colonists were real people who made real choices, and those choices had real consequences that we cannot trace. The silence that surrounds them is not a void. It is an absence, a space where testimony should exist but does not, where voices should speak but cannot be heard. What we can trace, imperfectly and incompletely, is the aftermath. The ripples that the vanished colonists sent forward through time, the ways their disappearance shaped the English colonial project that would eventually consume the continent they had briefly inhabited. The immediate aftermath was confusion and abandonment. John White returned to England after the 1590 voyage, having failed to search Croatoan Island due to storms and the reluctance of his ship's crew to remain in dangerous waters. He spent the remaining years of his life attempting to organize another relief expedition, writing letters to Richard Hakluyt and other promoters of American colonization, pleading for resources that never materialized. His last known letter, written in 1593, describes his everlasting sorrow at being unable to discover the fate of his daughter and granddaughter. He died sometime around 1606, still not knowing, his final years shadowed by a grief that had no resolution. Sir Walter Raleigh, who had financed the Roanoke venture, found himself increasingly occupied with other matters. His attempts to find El Dorado in South America, his complicated relationship with Queen Elizabeth, his eventual fall from favor under King James I, his imprisonment in the Tower of London, his final disastrous expedition to Guyana, his execution in 1618. All of these consumed his attention and resources. Roanoke became a footnote in a life crowded with more immediate dramas. He never organized a serious effort to discover what had happened to the colonists whose settlement he had sponsored. The colony fell into a kind of administrative limbo. Raleigh's charter gave him rights to colonize the region, but he had neither the resources nor the freedom to exercise those rights. The Virginia Company, formed in 1606, operated under a new charter that technically superseded Raleigh's claims, though the legal situation was murky and Raleigh, then imprisoned, could not have contested it anyway. The Jamestown settlers who arrived in 1607 were establishing a new English presence in the same broad region, but they were not continuing the Roanoke project. They were starting over. And yet Roanoke haunted them. The Jamestown colonists knew about the lost colony. They had read the accounts published by Hakluyt. They knew that 117 English people had vanished into the American wilderness, and they did not know whether those people were dead, alive, integrated into indigenous communities, or something else entirely. This knowledge shaped their expectations and their fears in ways that are difficult to fully trace but impossible to ignore. Some of the Jamestown colonists believed, or hoped, that the Roanoke settlers might still be alive somewhere in the interior. Expeditions were sent to search for them, or at least to inquire about them among indigenous nations. The results were inconclusive and often contradictory. Some reports suggested that the colonists had been killed years earlier in attacks by the Powhatan Confederacy or their allies. Other reports suggested that some had survived, living among indigenous communities to the south. John Smith, never the most reliable narrator, recorded stories about English people living in stone houses in the interior, using English tools, maintaining English customs, preserved somehow across the decades. These stories may have been true. They may have been misunderstandings. They may have been deliberate fabrications designed to manipulate the English. They may have been wishful thinking. One story, recorded by William Strachey around 1612, claimed that the Powhatan Confederacy had massacred the surviving Roanoke colonists shortly before the Jamestown settlers arrived. The chief Powhatan himself had ordered their deaths because they were living among a rival nation that threatened his power. The story cannot be verified and may have been propaganda, an attempt to justify English hostility toward the Powhatan by attributing to them the murder of English innocents. Or it may have been true. We cannot know. What is certain is that the Roanoke colonists were not found. Jamestown developed and grew and struggled through its own crises, the starving time of 1609-1610, when the majority of the colonists died of starvation and disease, the Anglo-Powhatan Wars that followed, the eventual stabilization that came through tobacco cultivation and territorial expansion. The colony survived, barely, repeatedly on the edge of annihilation, and eventually became permanent. Virginia became English, then British, then American. The continent opened to European settlement, and Roanoke remained lost. The colonists, who might have been the founding parents of English America, became instead its founding mystery, the question that could not be answered, the silence at the heart of the colonial story. The historiography of the lost colony has its own history, a parallel narrative of interpretation and reinterpretation that reflects the concerns of each era more than it reveals the truth of what happened. In the early colonial period, Roanoke was cited primarily as a warning, proof that American colonization was dangerous, that the indigenous peoples could not be trusted, that careful planning and adequate resources were essential to survival. The colonists were martyrs to English imperial ambition, victims of circumstances beyond their control, symbols of the risks that England had to accept if it wanted its share of the New World. In the 19th century, as American national identity consolidated around myths of exceptional destiny and unique virtue, Roanoke became something different, a romantic tragedy, a story of innocence destroyed, of pioneers swallowed by an untamed wilderness. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, became a figure of peculiar fascination, the pure beginning that never had a chance to flower, the daughter of the New World who vanished before she could grow. Her name was given to counties and schools and historical societies. Her image appeared on stamps and commemorative coins. She became, in a sense, the patron saint of American innocence, the child who represented everything the nation wanted to believe about its origins. This romanticization carried darker undertones. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when racial ideology dominated American public discourse, Roanoke was sometimes invoked to illustrate supposed truths about racial mixing and cultural contamination. If the colonists had survived by integrating into indigenous communities, the argument went, then their descendants would be mixed-race peoples, and this was presented either as a tragedy of lost racial purity or, more rarely, as evidence that such mixing could produce viable communities. The gray-eyed Indians, mentioned in colonial accounts, became the focus of intense interest, their supposed existence cited as proof that English blood persisted in the American population even when English culture did not. These interpretations tell us almost nothing about what actually happened at Roanoke. They tell us a great deal about what Americans have wanted Roanoke to mean, the symbolic purposes they have pressed the mystery into serving. The colonists themselves, the actual people, with their fears and hopes and daily concerns, disappear behind the weight of meaning that later generations have laid upon them. Modern scholarship has attempted to strip away these accumulated layers of interpretation and examine the evidence itself. Archaeologists have excavated sites on Hatteras Island, at Roanoke Island, and at interior locations that might have been destinations for migrating colonists. Historians have re-examined the primary sources, reading White's account against itself, looking for inconsistencies and omissions, trying to reconstruct what he might have seen that he did not record. Scientists have analyzed tree rings to reconstruct the climate of the 1580s and 1590s, establishing the severity of the drought that gripped the region during the crucial years. Each approach has added fragments to our understanding. None has provided the complete answer that popular interest craves. The archaeological evidence is suggestive, but fragmentary. English artifacts have been found in indigenous contexts on Hatteras Island: metal tools, pottery fragments, gun parts, indicating that some English materials reached Croatoan communities. Whether these materials arrived with colonists seeking shelter, through trade between indigenous groups, or as loot from a destroyed settlement, cannot be determined from the objects themselves. The artifacts prove contact. They do not prove what kind of contact. Site X, the inland location identified through analysis of watermarks on a John White map, has yielded a different pattern of evidence. Preliminary excavations found English pottery and metal fragments alongside indigenous materials, suggesting a mixed or hybrid settlement. But the excavations are ongoing, and interpretation remains contested. The site might represent a destination for some of the colonists. It might represent a later trading post or residence that has nothing to do with the lost colony. The archaeology is still being done. The answers are still being sought. What the modern research has established most convincingly is context. We now understand, as earlier generations did not, the environmental and political circumstances that the colonists faced. We know about the drought. We know about the fractured relationships between indigenous nations. We know about the food systems and settlement patterns that shaped the region before English arrival. We know about the ways that indigenous peoples incorporated outsiders into their communities, the protocols for adoption and alliance that might have governed the colonists' fate if they sought shelter among native groups. This context does not solve the mystery, but it makes the mystery more human. It replaces the romantic image of innocence swallowed by a hostile wilderness with a more complicated picture of real people navigating real circumstances, making choices constrained by factors they could not control, adapting or failing to adapt to a situation that demanded adaptation. The colonists were not simply victims, they were agents, however limited their agency. They tried to survive. The question that the research addresses is not simply what happened to them, but what options did they have, and what would each option have required, and what might it have produced? The answer, the real answer, the complete answer, may never be found. The archaeological record preserves some things and destroys others. The documentary record was always thin and has not grown thicker with time. Some of the evidence we would need to solve the mystery simply does not exist and never will exist. The colonists' voices are silent. Their testimony was not recorded. Their descendants, if any survived, did not preserve a continuous memory of their origins that we can trace. What remains is the carved word, Croatoan, a gesture toward an answer that points in a direction without specifying a destination. The colonists were telling John White something. They were leaving a message for a man they expected to return, indicating where they had gone or intended to go. The message reached its recipient 3 years late. The recipient could not act on it. The thread was severed, and yet the word persists. Croatoan. It has become a kind of cultural talisman invoked in popular culture as a symbol of mysterious disappearance, used in television shows and novels and horror stories as shorthand for the unsolved and unsolvable. The word has taken on meanings that the colonists who carved it could not have imagined, meanings that have nothing to do with the Croatoan people themselves, the indigenous nation, whose name was appropriated first by the colonists and then by the myth-making that followed. The Croatoan people are largely absent from the mythology of the lost colony. They appear as background figures, potential rescuers, or potential threats, but rarely as fully realized historical actors with their own motivations and concerns. This absence reflects the broader pattern of indigenous erasure in American historical memory, the tendency to treat native peoples as landscape rather than as participants in history, as contexts rather than as agents. But the Croatoan had their own story, their own relationship with the English, their own decisions to make about how to respond to the strange people who arrived on their shores with metal tools and deadly diseases and insatiable hunger for land. Mantio's decision to serve as translator and intermediary was not inevitable. It was a choice, made for reasons we can only speculate about: curiosity, ambition, the hope that alliance with the English might benefit his people, the simple human desire to see new things and learn new knowledge. His baptism and elevation as Lord of Roanoke might have been a triumph or a betrayal, or something more complicated than either. He had his own perspective on the colonists' fate, and that perspective was not preserved. If some or all of the colonists did go to Croatoan Island, they would have been received according to Croatoan protocols, judged by Croatoan standards, integrated, if they were integrated, on Croatoan terms. They would have become, to some degree, Croatoan themselves. Their children would have grown up in Croatoan communities, learning Croatoan languages, practicing Croatoan customs, knowing the English world only through stories told by aging parents who remembered a life that had ended. These children would not have been lost. They would have been found by a people who gave them a place in a community that continued when the English colony did not. This possibility is not a rescue fantasy, but a recognition that survival takes many forms. The colonists' descendants, if any existed, might have lived full lives in communities that valued them, contributing to societies that functioned on their own terms. They would not have been English anymore, not in any meaningful cultural sense, but they would have been alive. They would have had children of their own. They would have been part of the human story that continued on the American continent, regardless of what the English colonial project did or did not accomplish. Or they died. Some of them certainly did. Disease, starvation, violence, accident, the causes of death are varied, and the Roanoke colonists had no immunity to any of them. Whatever happened to the colony, some people did not survive it. Some proportion of the 117 souls who arrived in 1587 were dead within months, within years, within however long it took for the final crisis to come. Their bodies were buried or burned or left where they fell, and the earth took them back, and no marker preserves their resting places. The dead colonists are perhaps the most forgotten of all. The mythology focuses on disappearance, on mystery, on the romantic uncertainty of not knowing. But there is nothing mysterious about death. People die. English colonists in the 16th century died at appalling rates from causes that we now understand and can prevent. The Roanoke colonists were exposed to those causes with no protection and no recourse. Some of them died. Many of them probably died. The question is not whether colonists died, but whether any survived, And even the survivors, if there were survivors, are dead now. 4 centuries have passed. Whoever lived through the crisis of the late 1580s, whoever made it to Croatoan Island or Site X, or some other destination, whoever raised children and grew old in whatever circumstances they found themselves, those people are gone now. Their lives ended centuries ago. Whatever they knew about what happened to the colony died with them, passed perhaps to children who passed it to their children until the chain broke and the memory faded and the story was lost. The past does not preserve itself for our convenience. It does not maintain records because we might want to consult them someday. It does not answer questions simply because we ask them. The past is silent, and the silence is not mysterious. It is merely the condition of time, the ordinary disappearance of lived experience into the void that swallows everything that is not deliberately preserved. The Roanoke colonists left no journals, wrote no surviving letters, carved only a single word into a single post that rotted away centuries ago. They left behind the traces that archaeology finds, the fragments that careful excavation uncovers, the evidence that patient analysis interprets. They left behind the questions that we ask because we cannot help asking them. They left behind the possibility of America. Before Roanoke, English settlement in the Western Hemisphere was theoretical, a project discussed in courts and counting houses, debated by philosophers and speculators, but never actually attempted by the ordinary families who would be required to make it work. Roanoke made the attempt failed, or rather, it produced an outcome we cannot fully characterize, an ambiguous result that history has classified as failure because the colony did not persist as an English community on English terms. But Jamestown came after, and Plymouth came after that, and the tide of settlement that followed washed across the continent, displacing indigenous peoples, transforming landscapes, building the nation that would eventually dominate the hemisphere. The Roanoke colonists were part of that tide's first surge, the wave that broke before it reached the shore. Their failure was also a kind of beginning. Their disappearance was also a kind of founding. They vanished into American history, and American history continued in their absence, shaped by their example even as it forgot their names. The question that remains, the question that has persisted for 437 years and will persist for as long as anyone cares to ask it, is not what happened to the Roanoke colonists. That question has 1,000 possible answers, and some of them are almost certainly correct, and we will never know which ones. The question that remains is why we cannot let them go. Every generation rediscovers Roanoke. Every generation asks the same questions, proposes the same theories, feels the same mixture of fascination and frustration at the silence of the historical record. The Lost Colony has been the subject of plays and novels, documentaries and academic monographs, amateur expeditions and professional excavations. It has been blamed on everything from Spanish raiders to drought to alien abduction. It has been solved definitively at least a dozen times, each definitive solution subsequently replaced by another definitive solution that contradicts the first. The colony refuses to stay found. It insists on remaining lost, not because the evidence is insufficient, though it is, but because the loss itself has become the story. We do not want to know what happened to them. We want to wonder. This is not a criticism. The wondering is itself a form of attention, a way of keeping the dead alive in memory even when we cannot name them or locate their graves. The Roanoke colonists endure not despite their disappearance, but because of it. Had they succeeded, had John White returned in 1588 to find a thriving settlement, had the colony grown and flourished and eventually merged into the broader stream of English colonial history, they would be as forgotten as any other group of early settlers. We remember Jamestown because it nearly failed. We remember Plymouth because the story has been mythologized beyond recognition. We remember Roanoke because it vanished, because the vanishing created a space that the imagination rushes to fill. The imagination is not nothing. The stories we tell about the past shape how we understand ourselves in the present. The Roanoke colonists have been made to carry meanings they could not have imagined, symbols they would not have recognized. They have been cast as martyrs and victims, as heroes and fools, as warnings and inspirations. They have been used to argue for English exceptionalism and to critique English arrogance. They have been romanticized into noble adventurers and demythologized into desperate refugees. They have been everything that every generation has needed them to be, because they left behind so little of themselves that almost anything can be projected onto the blank screen of their absence. Virginia Dare became the most extreme example. The first English child born in the Americas, she appears in the historical record exactly twice, at her baptism on August 18, 1587, and when her grandfather departed 9 days later. That's all we know. We do not know what she looked like beyond infancy, what personality she developed, what skills she learned, what language she spoke, whether she lived to adulthood or died in childhood, whether she had children of her own or passed without descendants. We know nothing. And into that nothing, centuries of American mythmakers have poured their fantasies. In the 19th century, Virginia Dare became a symbol of white American purity, her image appropriated by nativist movements seeking to restrict immigration and maintain what they called the integrity of the American race. The first white child born in America, they called her, though of course she was not white in any sense that her parents would have recognized. The category did not yet exist, as Americans would later construct it. She was English, which was identity enough. But the mythmakers needed her to be white, needed her to be the innocent origin of a white nation, needed her blonde infant innocence to stand at the symbolic beginning of a story that ended with them. They put her image on stamps and statues. They named counties and schools after her. They made her the Virgin Mother of American whiteness, a figure of impossible purity onto which they could project their anxieties about the contamination they saw all around them. The irony, of course, is that if Virginia Dare survived at all, she almost certainly did so by becoming exactly what the nativists feared, a person of mixed heritage, raised in an indigenous community, speaking an Algonquian language, following Algonquian customs, bearing children whose descendants would be indistinguishable from the other native peoples of the Carolina coast. The genetic studies are suggestive. The oral traditions are consistent. If Virginia Dare lived, she lived as a Lumbee ancestor, or a Croatoan descendant, or a member of whatever community absorbed the remnants of the English colony. Her whiteness, if she retained any consciousness of it at all, would have been a memory from earliest childhood, a language she no longer spoke, a set of customs she no longer practiced. She would have become American not in the way the nativists imagined, but in the way that America actually developed. Through mixture, through adaptation, through the blending of peoples that no ideology of purity could prevent. This is the deeper meaning of Roanoke, if meaning is what we seek. The colony did not vanish, it transformed. The people did not disappear, they dispersed. The sharp line between English and indigenous that the colonial imagination required was blurred from the very beginning, and Roanoke was the first and most dramatic demonstration of that blurring. The colonists who carved Croatan into that post were not leaving a distress signal or a desperate clue. They were leaving a destination. They were saying, "We have gone to join the people who know how to live here." They were admitting what the colonial project could never officially acknowledge, that survival in the New World might require becoming something other than English. John White understood this, at least partially. In his paintings of the Carolina Algonquians, made during the 1585 expedition, he depicted them not as savages or devils, but as people, fishing, cooking, dancing, praying, raising children, burying their dead. His watercolors are among the most sympathetic European depictions of indigenous Americans from the contact period, and they reveal a man capable of seeing across the cultural divide that separated him from his subjects. He painted their villages with careful attention to architecture and layout. He painted their bodies with respectful attention to dress and ornament. He painted their ceremonies with genuine curiosity about religious practices utterly alien to his own. Whatever else John White was, he was not a man who believed indigenous peoples were inherently inferior or incapable of civilization. He saw them as different, certainly, foreign, certainly, but also human, also intelligent, also worthy of careful observation and accurate representation. This is perhaps why he was willing to leave his family at Roanoke. He knew the Croatoans. He had lived among them or near them during the previous expedition. He had painted their leaders and learned something of their language and customs. When he departed for England in August 1587, he was not abandoning his daughter and granddaughter to hostile strangers. He was leaving them in a place where allies existed, where survival was possible, where the local people had already demonstrated their willingness to trade and assist and negotiate with the English newcomers. He expected to return within months. He expected the colony to be struggling, perhaps, to be diminished, perhaps, but to be there, to be surviving, to be making it work. 3 years is a long time. 3 years is long enough for every assumption to be overturned, every plan to be abandoned, every hope to be transformed into its opposite. 3 years is long enough for the thin supplies to run out entirely, for the seeds to fail, for the fishing to collapse, for the relations with nearby peoples to sour or sweeten, depending on circumstances no one could predict. 3 years is long enough for Eleanor Dare to give birth again, or to die in childbirth, or to watch her husband Ananias die of disease, or to fall in love with someone else entirely, someone whose language she was slowly learning, whose customs she was slowly adopting, whose children would be raised in ways she could not have imagined when she boarded the ship in Plymouth. 3 years is long enough for Virginia Dare to learn to walk and talk and run and play, to grow from an infant into a toddler, into a small child who remembered nothing of the voyage or the landing or the first desperate months on Roanoke Island. 3 years is long enough for everything to change. When John White finally returned in August 1590, he brought with him not a rescue expedition, but a privateering voyage that had agreed to stop at Roanoke only as a brief detour from its real business of capturing Spanish ships. The captain was impatient. The crew was hostile. The weather was deteriorating. White had exactly one opportunity to find his colony, and that opportunity lasted less than 48 hours before a hurricane forced the ships to retreat and begin the long voyage back to England. Imagine him on that day. Imagine the boat approaching the shore, the smoke they had seen from the sea turning out to be a natural fire, not a signal from the colonists. Imagine the beach, empty. The path through the dunes, overgrown but still visible. The palisade, its posts still standing but weathered, battered, clearly untended for a long time. Imagine the carved letters Croatoan, no cross, no distress symbol, just the name cut deep into the wood by hands he could not identify. He would have touched the letters. He must have. He would have traced them with his fingers, feeling the grain of the wood, the depth of the cuts, the weathering that told him the carving was not recent. He would have called out, perhaps, his voice carrying across the empty settlement, across the silent dunes, across the water toward the mainland where the forests stretched inland for distances he could not imagine. He would have received no answer. He would have waited, listening, hoping for a sound that never came. The houses were gone. The trunks he had left behind, his armor, his books, his paintings, his maps, had been buried and then dug up, probably by hostile natives or perhaps by colonists scavenging their own supplies. The settlement had been deliberately dismantled, the logs and planks presumably carried away for use elsewhere. This was not the aftermath of a massacre. This was not the debris field of a sudden attack. This was evidence of a planned departure, an organized evacuation, a community that had made a decision and carried it out. Croatoan. The name would have meant something to White that it cannot mean to us. He knew the Croatoan people. He had met them. He had painted their chief, Mateo, who had traveled to England and returned, who had been baptized as a Christian, who had been formally invested as the Lord of Roanoke by the English colonists in a ceremony whose meaning the participants understood very differently. Mateo was an ally. Croatoan Island, the home of his people, was perhaps 50 miles to the south across Pamlico Sound on the thin barrier island that we now call Hatteras. If the colonists had gone there, they had gone to friends. They had gone to people who could help them survive. White wanted to follow. Of course, he wanted to follow. His daughter was there, perhaps. His granddaughter was there, perhaps. The answer to every question he had been asking for 3 years was there, perhaps 50 miles away across water that his captain refused to cross. The hurricane made the decision for everyone. The winds rose. The ships dragged their anchors. One anchor cable broke, then another. The captain announced that they were returning to the West Indies immediately, before they lost everything. White argued, pleaded, demanded. The captain was unmoved. They were leaving. They were leaving now. There would be no search. There would be no answers. John White never returned to America. He spent the rest of his life in England and Ireland, a man haunted by an absence he could not fill. In his final surviving letter, written in 1593, he committed the fate of the colonists to the mercy of God. He expressed confidence that they were alive, that the Almighty would preserve them. But he also expressed exhaustion, resignation, the weariness of a man who had spent 6 years trying and failing to keep a promise he had made on a summer day in 1587. He died sometime around 1593. The exact date is unknown. The location is unknown. The circumstances are unknown. Even John White, the man most responsible for the colony's existence and most dedicated to its survival, has been swallowed by the silence that takes everyone eventually. His paintings survived because they were copied by an engraver named Theodore de Bry, who published them in a book that became famous throughout Europe. The originals were lost. The man who made them is less remembered than the people he failed to save. What remains is the question. What remains is the word, Croatoan, carved into wood that rotted centuries ago, copied into reports that were filed and forgotten, resurrected by historians who recognized the power of a mystery that refused to be solved. The word has become the colony's epitaph, its only monument, the single fragment that survived when everything else was lost. It is not enough. It was never meant to be enough. It was a note left for someone who was supposed to return in a few months, not a message intended for posterity. The colonists who carved it could not have imagined that 4 centuries later, that single word would be virtually the only trace of their existence. But it is what we have. It is all we have, and so we hold on to it, this improbable artifact of absence, this word that meant one thing to the people who carved it and means something entirely different to us. Croatoan, a place name, a people's name, a direction, a destination, an answer that has become the most famous question in American history. The Carolina coast is different now. The dunes have shifted. The islands have migrated. The inlets have opened and closed and opened again as storms and currents reshape the barrier islands in their endless slow dance with the sea. Roanoke Island is no longer on the outer banks. It sits behind Bodie Island, protected from the Atlantic by a strip of sand that did not exist in the 16th century. The landscape the colonists knew has been transformed beyond recognition, the geography itself unstable, the very ground they walked on rearranged by forces no human effort can control. The Croatoan people are gone too, in the sense that the English colonists would have recognized them. Their descendants live on, in the Lumbee Nation, in other communities throughout the Southeast, in the mixed populations that emerged from centuries of contact and conflict and intermarriage. But the Croatoan villages that John White painted, the communities that Mateo led, the people who might have welcomed the English refugees in 1587 or 1588 or whenever the crisis came, those specific people, that specific culture, those specific ways of living and dying and remembering are gone as thoroughly as the colonists themselves. The indigenous peoples of the Carolina coast were devastated by disease and displacement and the relentless pressure of European expansion. They lost their languages and their lands and their sovereignty. They survived as peoples, but they survived by transforming into something new, something that preserved fragments of the old while adapting to conditions that the old could not have anticipated. Everyone involved in the Roanoke story is gone. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, ending the Tudor dynasty and leaving the colonial project to her successor, James, who would grant the charter that founded Jamestown. Sir Walter Raleigh was executed in 1618, beheaded in the courtyard of Westminster, on charges that had nothing to do with America, a cautionary tale about the dangers of royal favor and its withdrawal. Mateo disappears from the historical record after 1587. We do not know if he lived to see the colonists vanish, if he helped them survive, if he mourned them or celebrated their departure or felt nothing at all. Fernandez, the pilot who refused to take the colonists to Chesapeake Bay, presumably died at sea or in some port, his name attached to a decision whose consequences he never learned. And the colonists themselves, the 117 men, women, and children who stepped onto Roanoke Island in July 1587 and stepped out of history sometime in the following months or years, they are gone most completely of all. We have their names, some of them, but names are not people. We have the traces archaeology has uncovered, but fragments are not lives. We have the stories we tell about them, but stories are not memory, not really, not the kind of memory that preserves a person's voice, their habits, their way of laughing or crying or holding their children. We have nothing but the questions we ask, and the questions are our own, not theirs, shaped by our concerns rather than their lives. Roanoke Island still exists. You can go there. You can stand where the colonists stood, more or less, allowing for the uncertainties of archaeology and the changes in the landscape. You can walk the trails through the maritime forest, the live oaks draped in Spanish moss, the palmettos and pines that would look different from whatever grew there in 1587, but not unrecognizably so. You can stand at the water's edge and look across the sound toward the mainland, the vast continent that the colonists could not have comprehended, the interior that stretched westward for thousands of miles to mountains and rivers and plains they would never see. You can feel the humidity and hear the insects and smell the salt and the mud and the vegetation, the sensory environment that the colonists inhabited, the daily reality of their lives beyond the facts that history records. The air is still warm there in summer. The sun still sets over the mainland in colors that no painter has fully captured. The water still moves with the tides, flowing in and out through the inlets, connecting the sound to the ocean beyond. The wind still comes off the sea, carrying the smell of salt and the promise of storms. The place is not what it was. Nothing is ever what it was. But it is continuous with what it was, a point on a timeline that extends backward to the colonists and forward to us and beyond us to whoever comes after. They were here. That much is certain. 117 people lived and breathed on this small island, somewhere in these maritime forests, somewhere along these muddy shores. They built structures and cooked meals and tended children and argued and laughed and worried and hoped. They did the things that people do, the ordinary business of being alive that history so rarely preserves. They experienced weather and seasons, hunger and satisfaction, illness and health, fear and relief. They were, for a time that we cannot precisely measure, a community, a group of people who knew each other's names and habits and grievances and gifts. Then they were gone. The word carved into the post has long since rotted. The post itself is dust. The palisade that surrounded the settlement has left traces underground, post holes that archaeologists have mapped, but nothing visible remains. The island has been built over and dug up and built over again, the layers of history accumulating like sediment, the colonial period buried beneath the centuries that followed. There is a reconstructed fort now, a tourist attraction, a place where visitors can see what the settlement might have looked like, though no one knows for certain. The Fort Raleigh National Historic Site preserves the memory of the colony, or a version of the memory, a story shaped for contemporary audiences who come seeking a connection to something old and strange and unresolved. The connection exists if we want it to. The colonists were real. Their lives were real. The decisions they made and the consequences they faced were as real as any we face ourselves. They wanted to survive, to prosper, to build something that would last. They wanted what we want, a future for themselves and their children. They failed to achieve it on the terms they had imagined, but failure is not erasure. Their attempt mattered. It mattered to the people who came after, the colonists at Jamestown and Plymouth who learned from Roanoke's example. It mattered to the indigenous peoples whose world was beginning to change in ways they could not yet fully comprehend. It mattered to the future of a continent that would be transformed by the collision of worlds that Roanoke represented. The mystery endures because we want it to. We want there to be things we do not know, spaces where certainty cannot reach, questions that remain open despite our best efforts to close them. Roanoke gives us that. It gives us a story without an ending, a beginning that trails off into silence, a colony that steps into the American wilderness and does not step out again. It gives us the word Croatoan, a direction and a destination and a riddle all at once, an invitation to imagine what we cannot confirm. The colonists went somewhere. They did something. They lived for some period of time in conditions we cannot fully reconstruct. And then, one by one, or all at once, they stopped living, as everyone does, as everyone must. Their descendants, if they had descendants, carry fragments of their DNA without knowing it, genetic echoes of people whose names they have never heard. Their story, what little of it we possess, has been passed down through centuries of retelling, each generation adding its own interpretations, its own anxieties, its own hopes. They are part of us now, the Roanoke colonists. Not in any mystical sense, but in the ordinary sense that the past is always part of the present, that history is not a foreign country, but the ground beneath our feet. They came before us. They tried to do something difficult. They did not succeed in the way they hoped, but their attempt became part of the current that carried everyone who came after, part of the story that became America, part of the long and bloody and extraordinary process by which a continent was remade. The Carolina pines still grow on Roanoke Island. The Sound still glitters in the afternoon light. The storms still come, carrying rain and wind and the force that reshapes coastlines. The water does not remember the ships that crossed it. The air does not remember the voices that moved through it. The earth does not remember the bodies it received. But we remember. Imperfectly, inadequately, with more questions than answers. But we remember. We say their names, the ones we know. John White, Eleanor Dare, Ananias Dare, Virginia Dare. We trace the letters they carved into a post that no longer exists. We stand where they stood and try to imagine what they saw. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is what we have, what the past has left us, what memory can salvage from the wreckage of time. Somewhere, under the shifting sands of the Outer Banks, there may be traces yet to find. Somewhere, in the oral traditions of peoples whose ancestors knew the colonists, there may be stories yet to hear. Somewhere, in the vast genetic archive that every living person carries, there may be connections yet to discover. Or there may not. The past keeps its secrets. The silence is not malicious. It is simply silent, the ordinary condition of everything that was and is no longer. They came to build something lasting. They built, instead, a mystery. And the mystery has lasted for 4 centuries now and shows no sign of ending. Croatoan. The word endures. The people it named are gone. The people who carved it are gone. But the word remains, cut into the memory of a nation that did not yet exist, pointing toward a destination that can no longer be found. 117 people sailed across an ocean and stepped onto a shore and made a place for themselves in a world that was not theirs. And then they vanished into the forests and the marshes and the long, slow centuries that followed, leaving behind only a single word and the silence that surrounds it. The wind still moves through the Carolina pines. It sounds almost like voices if you listen, almost like names.